My late mother told me her ghost stories from a time when she worked as a charge nurse at a well-known hospital in my state. Please forgive me if the story is hard to follow, as she told me this when I was a kid. In the early 90s, my mother was fresh out of medical school and was fortunate enough to find a job at a prestigious hospital. The only downside of taking this job was the fact that she would be working the graveyard shift. A typical hospital night shift is 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. A couple of months into the job, she found out that one of her good friends from medical school had gotten a job at the same hospital as her. Unfortunately for my mother, her friend had gotten a day shift. On this particular day, my mother's friend ran into some car trouble and couldn't get a ride home. My mom, being the helpful person that she was, told her friend that she could pick her up and take her home before her shift started. My mom picked her friend up and took her home. Her friend was thankful for my mother and insisted that she stay and eat some dinner. My mother couldn't turn down the offer as she had rushed out of the house to go and pick up her friend in the first place. My mom and her friend sat at the dining room table eating dinner. In front of the table in the family room was a large fish tank. Looking at the tank, my mother noticed that all of the fish were pressed up against one side of it. She wasn't really bothered by this, but asked her friend, "Did you forget to feed your fish today?" "Why?" "All your fish are out and pressed against one side of the tank." My mother's friend looked at the tank and laughed. "Maybe it's my uncle. The fish would do that when he would look through one end of the glass." "I thought you mentioned to me that your uncle had passed away when you were in medical school?" "Yeah, sometimes I think he's just standing there looking at the fish, or maybe I'm losing it." They both laughed it off and finished dinner. My mother thanked her friend for dinner and left to make it to work on time. My mother was less than a mile away from work when she saw blue lights in her rearview mirror. She thought to herself, was I speeding? Did I forget to signal? Did I accidentally run a stop sign? All of this ran through her mind as she pulled over. The police officer came out to the car and up to the driver's side window. He shined the flashlight in my mother's eyes and asked for her license and registration. And then, the usual, "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" "No, sir." "Well, the person in the passenger seat is jumping around and clearly isn't wearing a seatbelt." "How can that be?" My mom confusingly looked over to the passenger seat, and of course, the seat was empty. The officer shined his flashlight into the car and froze. My mom turned to look at the officer, who was visibly shaken and pale. After a few seconds, the officer began to mutter, No, not today," and slowly paced back to his car. In a flash, the officer took off. Must be Uncle, she thought. My mom arrived at work and started with her normal routine. The night shift didn't faze her until around 12 a.m. While finishing some patient paperwork, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted someone walking around in a patient gown. Concerned, she nudged one of her coworkers to check on the patient who was wandering around in the hall. He got up, looked down the hall, and immediately turned around back towards my mother. There was no one there. Confused, she looked over the desk, and indeed, there was no one there except other nurses and doctors. At around 2 a.m., my mom had gotten tired and decided it was time to get some coffee. She got up from her desk and began walking to the break room. On her way to the break room, she spotted the same patient wandering around the hall. Not wanting to disturb the other patients and nurses, she decided to follow this patient. She followed them until they turned and walked into one of the rooms. She walked up to the room and looked in, expecting to find them. Instead, she walked into an empty cardiology room. My mother walked out and began to think that she was losing her mind. Before exiting the room, she looked at the room number and saw that it read 616. She wrote it down on a notepad and continued with her shift. When her shift ended, she began to put away her work in her locker and pulled out her notepad. She looked at it, and it read Cardiology 616. Remembering what had happened, she used the break room phone and called her friend. Half asleep, her friend answered. My mom began to explain what had happened to her and mentioned her experience with the police officer and her shift at the hospital. Finally, my mom asked, "How did your uncle pass away, if you don't mind me asking?" "Oh, he was having some heart problems and passed away from a stroke." "When you visited him in the hospital, can you recall what room he was in?" I think it was room 616. "I think it was your uncle I saw last night and this morning." "No kidding." My mom always told me that story, and she truly believed that she had seen her friend's uncle's ghost. Though the ghost said nothing to my mother, she could only ponder the reason why. It was late summer, and my mom and I had decided that we should go out for a little spontaneous hike. We did our research, and found one trail that said it was a 4-mile round trip. Sounded easy enough. We got up early that morning, and began our trek. The entire forest had a horrible vibe. Even my mom picked up on it, and she's never been into any of the paranormal, etc. We had been walking around for hours, and this forest just seemed to get weirder and weirder. We had plenty of water and food, so I really can't say if we were just dehydrated or tired. We began to hear singing in the woods, and we just stopped and stared at each other. We had to be miles into the forest by now. Our step counter was saying that we had well surpassed the promised 4 miles. Where on earth would singing be coming from out there? We just looked at each other and began laughing. I remember her saying, "No way," and shaking her head and carrying on. It had been quite some time now, and we hadn't encountered another person on the trail. Suddenly, this man walking really fast surpasses us and rounds a bend behind a rocky hill so that we can't see him anymore. He said no words, just came up behind us and darted by. Again, me and my mom laughed and envied his athleticism until we rounded the bend ourselves to find that he was completely gone, out of sight. The path after that bend was fairly straight, and you can see far ahead of you, so there's absolutely no way he would have been able to clear that area that fast. This time my mom stops and says, "You gotta be kidding me." We're thoroughly freaked out after this. Eventually, we reached the peak, and after walking that long, you'd think that someone would probably want to stay there for a while and enjoy the view. Well, we pretty much got to the top, looked, and then left. We never discussed it, but I could tell that we were both uncomfortable and just wanted to leave. We were maybe halfway back through the trail, and the sun was beginning to set. We were moving fast. Our step counter said that we had hiked 10 miles compared to the 4 that we had initially expected. As the forest got darker, I began to hear leaves crunching behind us. I reluctantly turned and noticed that it was a buck several yards away. We hurried along as to not disturb it further, but then I began noticing that something was off. It was following us from a distance. It did so almost like a predator, hiding and peeking. I tell my mom that we were being followed by the deer, and we were pretty much at a jog at that point. The buck would not let us go. I would sometimes notice that it would catch up and follow just beside us. It always remained several yards away, though, always lurking, head down. I've lived out in the country my entire life, and have seen all the deer that you can imagine. I've never been followed by one like this. This seemed more than just curiosity. It felt horrible. Predatory. I felt like I was in danger. Always hearing those footsteps behind me. The feeling of being watched. Clearly, we made it out unharmed. But I really wonder if it actually intended to hurt us, or if it was just ushering us out of the forest. All in all, it was a freaky experience.
Something is definitely up with those woods.
At the time when this happened, I was around 12 years old, living with my mom in a rundown apartment complex. The building we lived in was the smallest of the three in the complex, and it was shaped like an L, with our apartment being closest to the inside corner on the shorter side of the L. To our right was one other apartment with another single mother and her son, who was much younger than me. Below us was a family with 2 kids that I was friends with, and the apartment above us was empty. It wasn't the nicest area, so after dark we kept our windows and doors closed and locked. The reason I'm going into such detail is so that you can understand why I believe that this voice didn't come from anywhere other than in our apartment. We were up late one night. It was around 11 p.m., and my mom was looking at something on her computer. She and I would typically stay up late hanging out together, so this was completely usual behavior. The computer was tucked into one corner of our quote-unquote dining room, basically just a patch of linoleum off from the kitchen, and our living room was to our backs. We didn't have the TV on, nor did we have any other lights on other than the one in the dining room itself. I can't remember what we were looking at, but I do recall this sudden feeling that we were being watched. Many things that I attribute to unexplained paranormal activity happened while we were living here, so the feeling of being watched was incredibly uncomfortable, but not anything out of the ordinary. As I was beginning to shift in my seat to turn and look around, we both heard a sinister male voice say, "Meow." Conversation level, neither a whisper nor a yell, drawn out in an exaggerated, almost lilting tone, as if it were mocking us. I would say it took around 2 to 3 seconds for this voice to finish, and in that time I was able to feel every hair on my entire body stand on end. We immediately spun around, me nearly falling out of my chair to the floor, both of us nearly hyperventilating in absolute terror. My mom said something about, "If you aren't good, get the fuck out," or something to that effect. I'm honestly not sure how I slept that night, or any of the other nights we were there for, but we never heard anything like that again.
This is my sister's story. It happened when she must have been about 16. She's 22 this year. We live in Queensland, Australia, and this happened at my grandmother's house. Her land is quite big. There's about 7 acres for the area, considering that this happened right in the middle of a very well-populated suburb. Her house is right next to the school that my sister went to, like jump the fence next to. There are 3 houses on my grandma's street. I put street in quotations because it's basically just one giant driveway that my grandma lives at the end of. The neighbor's backyard is visible through some light trees at my grandma's front yard. The reason I explain this is because from reading a lot of Skinwalker stories, this doesn't seem like the typical setting. It must have been about 8 p.m. during winter in Australia, so it was pretty dark. She was dog-sitting my grandma's 2 very little dogs, Ruby and Crystal, for the weekend. She let them out to go to the toilet and kept an eye on them because they get distracted pretty easily. She called the dogs and only Crystal came running to the door. There's a dim light that illuminates the porch, but not her yard. She could barely see Ruby, but she was just sitting there, staring at her. She called her name a few more times in a high-pitched voice, which the dogs always come running to. Ruby took a few steps forward and just sat down again, still staring at my sister. My sister always emphasizes that Ruby looked all types of wrong. Her face appeared as if someone had tried to draw Ruby from memory, but just couldn't. She explains that it looked like a human crawling, but as if they were a dog. My sister was super freaked out. She noticed that she couldn't see or hear Ruby anywhere. She closed the door and ran into the room where both of the dogs had been sitting and where she was watching TV. And there they were, sitting on their bed, acting completely normal. She ran back to the door, and the thing pretending to be Ruby was gone. She locked the door and went straight to bed. It wasn't until recently that she brought up this story again. She had told it many times before, but considering I was about 8 the first time that she had told this story, I wasn't paying much attention to it. I recognized it as a Skinwalker since I loved the episode of the Jenna and Julian podcast where they talk about them. I went to my sister and told her that that was what it was. My sister and I, being the paranormal addicts that we are, spent hours telling our sister and dad about Skinwalkers. To this day, I'm still terrified that we have Skinwalkers in Australia.
Back in the mid-'80s, we were traveling through Tennessee on the way to visit friends in Texas. Mom was driving, and I, a teenager at the time, was navigating by using a paper map, as these were the days before cell phones and GPS. We made it past Nashville on I-40 pretty late at night. We were maybe an hour outside the city. I was charting our progress old school with pencil and paper. We pass an exit, I mark it. A minute later, a summer thunderstorm hit. Visibility dropped to nothing, all traffic slows to a crawl, and we decide to pull off at the next possible exit and find a motel to spend the night, because there's no way that we're making significant progress in this storm. Slow, white-knuckle driving ensues. An exit looms up on the right, no signage that we can see in the downpour, and we take it. At the top of the exit ramp, we turned right toward a brilliantly lit up gas station. It was a left turn onto an overpass crossing I-40 with no lights from that side of the interstate. We were on a dinky little road at that point. To our right, there was a gas station which we're rapidly passing. To our left and back behind some trees was what appeared to be a motel, but you couldn't make out the sign well in the rain. We drove past the gas station before we really realized that the road just ended ahead. The gas station was the only building on this side of the road. It went from a 1.5 lane that was paved to a 1-lane gravel road, we could see a short way ahead, to tire track dirt and grass, all over the space of maybe 20 yards. Now, we were past this gas station, and there was only one turnoff from this road. It was on our left. We took it and tried to back up and turn around to get back to the gas station. Unfortunately, the paved slope of that narrow, driveway-sized turnoff led steeply down into a huge mud pit. No backing up out of it. My mom put the car into low gear, turned hard, and headed back for the gravel road through the mud. We almost made it, but got mired out. The front passenger tire caught on the corner of an exposed concrete storm drain, maybe 3 feet from the road. Out of the car, into the rain and mud. We walked to the gas station. The place was spotless, super bright, and had 2 young men behind the counter. What sounded like one of Elvis's songs was playing on their radio inside. Attendants' first words on seeing us walk in were, "Did you get stuck in the mud?" They said it as a super enthusiastic, way too happy greeting. Like Disney staffer welcoming you as you walk into the park for the first time levels of happy. Also, these night shift clerks were dressed in suits that looked about 30 years out of date. The place was kinda creepy. We admitted that we had, indeed, gotten stuck. We asked if there was a towing company that we could call. They pulled out a phone book. Again, this was before cell phones or the internet, and started talking to each other. It was not a Nashville phone book, some little township. Population couldn't have been more than 100 from the handful of white pages, but the book had dozens of yellow pages of nothing but tow truck companies. Like literally hundreds of tow truck companies for this town too small to appear on the map. The attendants had a friendly debate about whose turn it was to get a car out of the mud. They decided to skip over the company who was theoretically next because there had been some sort of problem with them the last time that they were called out for a tow.
They made a decision on who to call and let my mom use their phone. More weirdness, and the creepiness intensifies. It was still storming, though less at that point. The truck arrives maybe 5 minutes later, brilliant white, not a speck of dirt or a drop of mud on it. I've seen vehicles in a new car lot that were dirtier. The two young men in the truck are also dressed like they had just stepped out of the 1950s. They were wearing freshly polished patent leather shoes without a drop of mud on them, along with starched white shirts, paper hats, and bow ties. We hike across the street next door to the mud pit where our car is stuck. The tow truck guys are horrified. "They almost got out of the mud?" they say to each other repeatedly. The subtext from their shocked tone is clear. No one must ever, ever escape the mud pit on their own. These people will have to take some sort of action to make sure that no one else gets as close as we did to escaping. They tow the car out. Easy peasy. We all go back to the gas station. We pay the tow truck drivers for services. The drivers let the gas station attendants know that my mom and I almost made it out of the mud on our own. The attendants, again, are horrified and shocked by this. By now we're getting huge, uncanny valley vibes from all four of these men, and not just them. The whole place is too clean, too brightly lit, and too weirdly out of date. It was a surprisingly good facsimile of a small town rest stop populated by real humans. Almost perfect, in fact. We are definitely in Creepy Town. If these guys were humans, there was seriously something off about them. If they weren't, they almost had their ordinary human act down pat. The truck drivers leave. The attendants turn, all super friendly again, and ask Mom and me if we're going to stay the night in the hotel across the road. They're so excited that we might spend the night here. They talk about how great it is. Mom and I make non-committal noises and return to the car. I tell Mom, we're not staying here tonight. She agrees wholeheartedly. The rain is finally letting up. We drive down I-40 to the very next exit. It was maybe 5 miles. We pull off and spend the night in a kind of crappy but ordinary motel. At least it's not the Bates Motel, we joke. The rest of the trip goes well. Then, several days later on the way home, Mom and I decide that we would really like to see the creepy town in the light of day. It couldn't have been that weird, could it? Heading back up I-40, we pass the exit where we actually did spend the night on the way down. We can see the hotel, the exit number matches the notes that I had made on the map, everything. Then we start looking for the next exit. The exit to Creepy Town. Should be about 5 miles along with an overpass. 5 miles pass. No exit. No overpass. 5 more miles later before we find the next exit off of I-40. It's the one that I had marked as being right before the storm first hit. In short, Creepy Town does not exist. I have traveled I-40 many times since, often remarking that, hey, there's that exit where the weird storm hit and we went to Creepy Town, and there's the exit that we actually did spend the night at. We never found the Creepy Town exit between those 2 points, ever again. I don't usually really believe in most myths and legends and stuff like that, but something I recently witnessed made me doubt myself. I don't know if I'm just being paranoid, but I might have had a very close encounter with something that is definitely not human and scared me out of my mind. Basically, last night I decided to go hang out with a close friend and skateboard around a bit, and I met some other friends from school down by a grocery store there. We decided to hang out for a while and walk around, and they told my friend and I that they needed to start walking home, and that they wanted to show us some apparently cool, sketchy treehouse, where people always go to chill and do drugs and whatnot on the way. We start walking that way, mostly through just suburban neighborhoods, and at that point, it's almost completely dark outside. There were around 7 of us at first, and people mostly started heading out until it was just said friend and I and a girl who had agreed to take us to see the treehouse since it was fairly close to her home. We take this pretty open path to a chain link fence with a hole in it. We go through using our phones as flashlights, and not far after there's another chain link fence with a hole in it, with the treehouse right behind, surrounded by loose bushes and a small forest. We're pretty scared at that point since it's dark, so the friend and the girl stay behind the fence while I go through the hole just outside. After looking at the treehouse for a few seconds, we start hearing rustling in the bushes. But all those scared dismiss it as a small animal, or maybe even one of our friends just messing with us since it's pretty close to several houses. Like an idiot, I keep standing outside the small hole in the fence, not moving while the rustling keeps moving around. We called out several times with no response, and the thing, whatever it was, kept shuffling and scuffing around in the bushes a little bit, rustling every few seconds. I tried looking, and could barely see it, but guessed that it was around half my height. It kept on, and after a bit we realized from the footstep patterns that it has begun to walk on 2 legs. This just about does it for us, and we get out of there, looking behind us every couple of seconds. On our way back, said friend told me earlier by the treehouse that he had caught a glimpse of something moving that was a whitish-gray color, a bit bigger than a large dog. I visited this treehouse again today with a couple more friends, and actually went up this time. But gladly, we didn't see or hear anything. And yes, I know that I would be the idiot to die in a horror movie.
This took place mid-July of 2020. I live in the city, but I often drive to my hometown, if you can even call it that. It's a grain elevator in the middle of a cornfield, just to get away from the hustle and bustle and enjoy some peace and quiet. I prefer to go on my hikes alone, sometimes with or without my dog, depending on what animals I'm trying to observe. This time I chose to go alone, so I parked my car at the river just a few miles from the woods that I wanted to walk through. There's something about being able to see everything illuminated by the moonlight and hearing the coyotes that makes me feel at peace. I'd finally made it halfway down the dirt road that leads to the woods. I stopped for a moment because I felt a whoosh of really cold air. I thought that was so strange because it was a muggy Indiana night, around 80 degrees. I stayed there for a moment looking around to see if there was a logical explanation for the draft that I could see with my eyes. But nada. At that point, I looked directly above me and saw 3 baby raccoons trying to sleep on a branch just above my head. I remember thinking to myself, that's kind of odd, aren't raccoons nocturnal? But I just appreciated them for a moment and kept on going. I get another 500 feet down the road and whoosh, another burst of cold air. I stop again to try and figure out how that was happening. There were clear skies, 0 wind. I couldn't think of a good explanation. Before I had much more time to think on it, I heard something. To the right of me was a mostly unkempt hay and grass field, probably about knee-high at most. The moon was so bright that it was impossible to not get a good view of everything. I hear this rustling in the grass, maybe 20 feet away from me, and then it just stopped. I could see the animal now. I'll do my best to describe it. It was on all fours, but it appeared that it had the ability to be bipedal if it chose to be. I could see the nape of its neck, down to where the animal's back legs would be. The hair on its back was very strange. It had a large, thick mohawk ridge along its spine. From what I could see of the animal, I assumed that it had to weigh close to 100 pounds. Its steps were very heavy. Nothing graceful at all about it. The rest of the hair on the animal's body looked similar to that of a chimpanzee or some sort of ape. The 2 front legs were very powerful, had a broadly set stance. But the thing that messed with me the most was the sound. I'll never forget it. I was holding my breath, hoping I had just run across one of the many feral swamp dogs and that he would run off since they don't like people. I realized quickly that I was wrong.
As I stood there staring, this animal started sort of loping, pacing into a figure-8 pattern. It did this for maybe 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. And then, the thing charged me. That's when it made the sound. There was something so wrong with its breathing. Forgive me if I'm being offensive, that's not my intent. But this animal sounded like someone who was trying to breathe but didn't have a nose, or some serious damage to its airways. It was like a snarl, growl, breath, all in one. I could hear it snap its jaws when it backed away from the bluff. This all happened so fast. Let me try to give more context. About another 500 feet away from where this happened, there's an old-fashioned settler's cabin. My first thought was to get there for safety, but before I could even make that choice, I heard a scream. Not a human scream. I'm not an expert, but through my many years of living in the woods and observing the different animals, I've got an okay ear for knowing what animal calls come from what animal. This scream sounded like a mountain lion. We don't even have those here. So basically I had to say no to that plan for safety. But wait, there's more. If you continue down the dirt road past the abandoned cabin, there's a small parking lot. The reason I didn't take my car there is because you're not supposed to be in that park at night. Well, someone else was there too. After I heard that scream, I heard a car and then started to see the headlights come over the hill toward me by the cabin. At this point, I was flipping out. The crazy animal that charged me was nowhere to be seen. There might be a crazed wildcat just a few feet away, and now some Cutlass Supreme is hauling ass in my direction. In all my wisdom and fantastic decision-making, I dove into the hayfield to hide from the car. Yes, the same field that the crazy animal was in. Thankfully, they didn't see me, but they were absolutely flying, tearing out of that place like a bat out of hell. It made me wonder if they had something to do with the screaming animal, or the weird one in the field. Needless to say, I had had enough of that night, and cut my way through other properties and woods to get back to the river where my car was. About a month ago, I started a new job doing security at a local community college. Being the new guy, I was pretty much shafted with the night shift right off the bat. Normally, I work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. on weekdays, and 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. on the weekends. It's a nice job, good pay, plenty of overtime. The campus doesn't have dorms, and I'm the only one here at night. It gets lonely and very quiet. Watching the security cameras is monotonous, and patrolling the empty dark halls can only be done for so long before boredom really starts to set in. When I first started, I had the expectation that I would be given the worst shift at the worst times, and I was right. I was put on the night schedule before I even got to see the place, really. It used to be an old Catholic academy for girls until the late 60s. It isn't particularly secluded, but more suburban. It sits up on a hill overlooking a highway. It has 5 floors in the new part of the building, 4 floors in the old convent and chapel wings. It was first opened in the 1890s by a religious order of nuns, particularly for young ladies who also wanted to be nuns. It grew out of that until eventually attendance dwindled, and it was sold to the state, who in turn converted it into a community college after almost a decade of disrepair. I'm not someone who dabbles in the occult or knows a lot about the supernatural. I mind my own business and try to do my job. But recently, this place has got me in rare form. I don't scare easily now. But just in the short time that I have worked here, I've started to think that something is up. The security cameras are typical CCTV cameras. No audio recordings. But in the monitor, I'll hear a crackling like static. There's no way to enable or disable audio on the monitor. It comes and goes.
I'll hear footsteps, like leather soles clopping down the hallways through the security monitor. When I go on patrols in the convent wing, the lockers that are typically reserved for the cleaning crew and faculty staff will be unlocked and wide open. I've seen them open on the cameras, but only my supervisor can play back the footage. Doors that I know I locked during my first patrol will then be unlocked and open on the third patrol. The motion sensors will detect something and turn on when I'm not even on that floor, and when I am, sometimes they don't even react to when I move down the hall. And when I go to what is now the library, it used to be the chapel, I can hear piano music coming from the hall where I had just came from. I don't really drink anymore. I don't do any drugs, prescribed or not. There's no history of mental illness, and this isn't just a one-time thing. I'm not sure how to tell my supervisor about it without sounding mad or cowardly. I don't even know if I'm posting this in the right area. Only 4 more hours left in my shift, anyway.
"10 years ago, I was a stupid 18-year-old kid who was living with his parents in Flagstaff, Arizona. We moved almost every 3 years due to the nature of my dad's work, so I got to see most of the country. It was a Tuesday in November. My mom said that we were packing up the apartment and moving to Seattle for what was going to be another year and 2 months. I had a small 300cc motorcycle at the time. I think it was a V-Star, but I could be wrong. And decided to hook up a GPS and use the time to go on a ride across the West Coast. My mother didn't like the idea, but I knew that I would be safe due to personal experience and knowing when and when not to ride. Besides, it would be a 3-day trip and I would get to see all sorts of neat stuff along the way. I notified my job that I was going to transfer, threw on my saddlebags, and a day later was on the road. I made it all the way through western Nevada in order to avoid LA traffic, and stopped prior to taking the I-5 into California. That evening I stayed in a Days Inn hotel. After breakfast and a talk with the locals, I crossed through Reno into western Cali. From there, it was only 4 more hours until I reached Oregon. Luckily, I had time to spare, so I wanted to take some back roads and discover what this dank, damp state had to offer. It was fall, and there was a deep chill in the air. Riding through it sent shivers down my spine like nothing else. November's weather in Oregon is almost identical to that of Pittsburgh during that season. It makes you want to curl up into a ball and sleep for a decade, only to wake up and repeat the process all over again. Eventually, I got tired enough that I wanted to find somewhere to stay, and managed to see a sign advertising a Green Hills hunting lodge on the side of the road. It was accompanied by a long, steep hill that took me what felt like an hour to climb. Then, when I reached the top, I was greeted by a large and gorgeous cabin that looked like it was specifically made for weddings, like something ripped out of a fairy tale. Bewildered, I parked my bike, took off my bags, and threw a tarp over it, which was secured to bungee cords. I walked inside and met a Korean woman who was working the front desk. She spoke perfect English, but had a very distinct accent in which she explained to me that I could choose my room due to an abundance of vacancy. Cool, right? I chose room 31, as the entire building was all on one floor that evening. She handed me a key with the tag 31 attached via a keyring and tells me to have a good night. I throw all my stuff down and head to the bathroom to wash up after riding for an entire day. The room itself looks like a cabin and is absolutely gorgeous. The floorboards were all real wood, and even the shower had the same natural wood as the tub surrounding it. I take a shower and then head to bed, and realize that the mattress is incredibly comfortable and make myself cozy, only to realize that something is off. It's not something obvious, but I knew that there was some sort of oddity about this place. I push it to the back of my mind and fall asleep. The next morning, I wake up to find that the walls went from a natural brown to a deeper gray, as if they were stained overnight. This wasn't a result of natural lighting versus LED. The room was without a doubt a different color. I shrug it off and get all my stuff together, making sure that everything is still where I left it. I head out of the room to find that not only had the walls changed color, I was on a second floor that previously didn't exist. The light from the morning sun wasn't permeating the windows of the cabin, and there was no one in sight. I started to freak out, nearly having a panic attack because this wasn't right. Thankfully, there were stairs that I dashed down as fast as I could and made my way to the front desk and rang the bell once, twice, 3 times. I was breathing heavy and knew that I had to get out of there. No one was coming to check up on me after about 10 minutes of waiting, so I dashed out of the doors and into the lot. I ripped the tarp off of my bike and looked back at the lodge. It wasn't the same. This was a broken down, abandoned, dirty building that looked as though it was about to be condemned. I didn't want to ask any more questions, and rode off as fast as I could. That place still haunts me, even to this day.
A year or so ago, when I was 19, I was home alone and my dogs were in the backyard. I was on spring break. My younger brother was at his high school. Both of my parents and my uncle that lives with us were working. It was like early afternoon, 12 p.m. when I woke up and went to make my breakfast and stuff. I was watching a YouTube video while eating my scrambled eggs. I don't remember what the video I was watching was about, but I finished eating and went to sit on the couch for like 10 minutes, and then I had the sudden urge to go to the bathroom. I stood up and took my phone with me and started watching another video, closed the door, started doing my business, and at the same time my phone was at max volume. Then, all of a sudden, clear as day, I heard a woman hum outside the door. It sounded like a lullaby. Once again, clear as day, I heard it. It lasted for like 5 to 7 seconds, and I was dumbfounded. I always believed in spirits, ghosts, etc., but I thought logically at first that it could have been the video I was watching. So I rewound it to make sure. But no, that hum did not come from my video. Then I thought it must have been my mom coming home from work early because she does that sometimes. So I called out to her. I stood up, didn't even finish doing my business, opened the door and called out again to my mom, with no answer. I sat back down. I replayed the video a couple more times and once again made sure that that sound did not come from any video or any noise on my phone. So I finished up, flushed, left the bathroom, and looked around the house, checking to see if my mom had arrived and just didn't hear me calling. But she wasn't home. I checked on my 3 dogs, and they were just laying there like nothing had happened. Then I called my mom on the phone and told her what had occurred. She also believes in spirits and said not to worry. I told my brother, and all he said was, "Bruh." Then I told my dad, who is also a believer of spirits, but he takes a more logical view. Like, he makes sure that nothing natural could have caused it, before telling me if the spirit comes back to tell them to go away and ask for the lottery number. I don't remember when this occurred, but I'm pretty sure I was still 19 when it happened. But one night, I was going to bed. Me and my brother share a room. He's been asleep for a while, and I think it was around 1 a.m. You know, that stage when you're about to fall into deep sleep, but you're still aware of your surroundings. Like you can hear things as if you were awake. So right before I fell into that deep sleep, once again clear as day, I heard the same woman's voice. It wasn't my mother's voice, but this time I heard the voice right next to my ear. It was whispering something to me, but I don't recall what it said. But it was perfectly clear, and it was right next to my ear. I instantly woke up and opened my eyes, but there was no one there. I stayed awake probably for another 30 minutes under my sheets before falling back to sleep. I told my brother and my parents the next day of what I had heard, and my mom said that she would see what she could do. Legit, that was the last time that I heard the spirit. So to this day, I'm trying to remember what the spirit whispered. But I just don't know.
I don't know if I had sleep paralysis, but this happened almost a year ago. I was sleeping, and then all of a sudden I heard loud bangs. I don't know if it was gunshots or fireworks. I just know it caught me off guard. And then all of a sudden I felt something hit my spine. I couldn't move my legs or arms. I was sleeping on my right side facing my wall next to the window. I kept my eyes closed and I tried moving, fighting whatever was holding me down. Tried kicking. I didn't yell even though I was about to scream so that my parents could come. But then I started to feel my legs again and kept kicking until I had full control back. I kept my eyes closed and fell asleep. I woke up in the morning, wanting to check and make sure that I didn't catch a bullet. But that only happened to me once. I work in a pharmacy that's located inside a nursing home, and I've been working there for the past 4 years. Just a note to mention, I've had many prior paranormal experiences in my life, but this is still ongoing. I've always felt a presence since the first week that I started, but it was never anything that made me feel threatened. Things didn't really start happening until last year, when I was talking to my coworkers about feeling a presence, and asking if that was something that they had experienced as well. The day after I had a conversation with my coworker, I was working a night shift. On our night shifts, there's only one technician and a pharmacist. I was sitting at the back counter on my computer when I thought that I had seen someone come through the door. We're usually not busy at night, but there is the odd time when one of the nurses will come down for a bag of chips or a pop. I got up from where I was seated and walked over to where our cash register was, and from there you can see the pop coolers and the chip racks. I couldn't see anyone, so I left and walked back and forth, looking down the aisles. Nobody was there. I asked my coworker if he had seen anyone come in, and he said no. But I was 99.9% sure that someone had walked through that door. I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I decided that I was probably just tired. I sat back down in my chair and started filling prescriptions. About 25 minutes later, I looked up and saw a pack of toilet paper slowly moving forward to the edge of the shelf before it dropped on the ground, startling me. There's absolutely no way that it could have just been our air system or a draft that had knocked it off. My coworker saw this too, and also thought it was odd. I told him it was a spirit that moved it, and he looked at me like I had 5 heads. So, to prove my point, I brought up the security camera footage. On the video, you can see 2 bright and fairly large orbs moving around as the toilet paper was being moved. I showed it to him, and there was no denying that it was a spirit trying to make itself known. That was my first significant paranormal experience at the pharmacy. We've had things go missing only to find them in the strangest places. For example, my car keys went missing one day from my locker, only for me to find them in with the prescription vials. My coworkers all swore up and down that nobody had hidden them there, and I most definitely didn't. Things are always falling off of the shelves, and sometimes they're heavy items, not just something light like the toilet paper incident. We had a 5-kilogram jug of Epsom salts crash onto the ground and break open, and no one was even remotely close to the aisle. Many of my coworkers and I see what looks like someone walking by out of the corner of our eye, only to realize that no customers are in the store. We also hear what sounds like the door to the front entrance open and close, and nobody is coming in. This happens multiple times a day, sometimes. The only time I've ever felt threatened or scared so far was when I was working the night shift and got locked in the bathroom.
It could well have been a hardware malfunction, but I don't believe that it was. The handle locked from the inside, and I don't normally lock it anyways. I did my business, flushed the toilet, and washed my hands. I went to exit the seemingly unlocked door and felt that it was being held shut from the other side. I figured it was just my coworker messing with me, so I started yelling his name, and that it wasn't very funny until let me out. The handle started moving as if someone was on the other side, wiggling it. I yelled again for my coworker, and he must have finally heard me because I could hear his footsteps. He asked what was wrong, and then pulled the door open with ease. He's now finally starting to believe that I wasn't crazy, and that this place actually has some paranormal activity going on. Say their name, and it will kill them. We live in an isolated community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her two brothers were home alone, while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and uncle were getting ready for bed. Outside, they heard noises, as if someone were moving things around the house. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a large figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary, because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncle were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out their rifle and steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and began to walk toward them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong that it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off in the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked toward the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran toward the truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. This thing was poking out its head to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed over the gun and placed an ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired toward the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed, and the dark figure began sprinting. My grandma chased my aunt inside, and my uncle and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman, but not only that. Whoever it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling out about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared, and that he knew it was her, and to leave his family alone. A few days passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandfather had yelled about had passed away. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is, say their name, and it will kill them. Starting with a bit of backstory, I'm a born and raised Long Islander. So are my parents. They met out east, which in Islander talk means the east end of the island. To any New York City rich kids, that means the Hamptons. But for the rest of us who are coincidentally not millionaires, it means the North Fork. Not to get geographically confusing, but Long Island is an accurately named Long Island that forks off about 3/4 of the way down the 90 miles that it stretches. It looks kind of like a fish with its mouth open, with the North Fork being where the eyes are, and the Hamptons being the jaw. Shelter Island is somewhere in the middle, like a smaller fish about to be eaten. Honestly, just save yourself a lot of contemplating and just Google it. So, my mom's family had a summer house on the North Fork. My dad's family had a house on Shelter Island. My parents met working at a summer job, and the rest is, clearly, history. But super long explanation short, I grew up getting to pretend to be bougie, because I had not one but 2 summer houses. Shelter Island was my favorite place. In a lot of ways, just the island itself feels magical. The only access is by ferry, and while traveling there, you feel like you're being transported into a different world. But the picture of Shelter Island in the summer is very different than the winter. In the summer, the population rises to around 20,000 people, but in the winter, no more than 2,000. There are something like 14 students in a graduating class. The people there literally dress up like each other for Halloween. This doesn't necessarily pertain to my encounter, but it's for real creepy and makes me wonder just how involved my encounter could be with the locals. So I was around 12 or 13. I had invited my best friend Lauren to come out with my family that weekend. I was so excited, as it was the first time that Lauren was able to. I remember our bathroom was being renovated, and so the only other bathroom we could use was in the dank, dark basement. That's only connection to the house was by going outside and down the stairs, and then down another set of stairs, and into the basement itself. So it had to have been around 10 o'clock, and we went together to the bathroom to brush our teeth. The moon was almost full, so bright that it provided some light to an island where street lamps were few and far between. If it wasn't for the light of the moon, we probably would have passed the creature altogether without realizing, because out there you can hardly see 2 feet in front of you when it's dark. As we were coming back up the stairs, laughing about something menial, that was when we saw it. It was about 10 feet away with its back to us, lurking near my shed. We both froze, and did that thing where you take a quick breath and hold it involuntarily. That made the creature notice us. Its head whipped around, and his eyes were glowing a kind of blood red. It didn't look angry per se, but rather like a feral dog. Not knowing how to react to these 2 little girls suddenly observing it. Almost as if not to scare us, he slowly rose up to full size, which I would guess was around 7 feet. The whole time, it never broke eye contact. I felt I could fall into the pits of blood that its eyes were. It was covered in long, shaggy black hair and had legs like that of a beast. After standing there, frozen in horror, for at least a full minute, all the while in the middle of this staring contest, we both regained control of our feet and ran up the stairs, screaming for my parents. We told my dad repeatedly that we had seen a werewolf, and he went out first, and we followed. He quickly dismissed it and went back inside, a bit disgruntled. I could have sworn that I saw a bush nearby to where it had been move. Over the years, I've had many theories, one of which is that the natives who lived on the island before the white man are responsible, as shape-shifting legends are prevalent in indigenous peoples' cultures. However, skinwalkers in native legend usually choose to be so, very unlike the werewolf curse we so know and love. Maybe it's the descendants of the people who stole this land, cursed to turn under the full moon, choosing isolation to protect their secret, for 9 months out of the 12, anyway. I work at a mental health facility. Strange things happen a lot, like doors closing and opening, seeing things out of the corner of your eye. You know, normal, creepy hospital stuff. Well, I had the creepiest experience. One night about a year ago, I'm working on the Adolescent unit, night shift. I just saw something move out of the corner of my eye. Then immediately afterward, this girl comes running out of her room screaming that the devil comes at 3:33. She's just repeating it over and over again. We get her some meds, and she goes back to sleep. The next night, it happens again. This time I look back at the clock, and it is in fact 3:33. They don't have clocks in their rooms, and they can't have watches, so there's no way that she knew what time that it was. We played back the camera, and she just went from dead asleep to balls to the wall. So this girl does this every single night for her entire stay, which was about 5 days. During that time, the quote-unquote creepy hospital stuff seemed to happen even more. Random door buzzers were going off, doors were opening and closing, lights were flickering. That creepy being watched, hair sticking up on your neck feeling was happening all the time. Every day she would say that she didn't remember getting up, and had no idea what we were talking about. About a week afterward, she got transferred to a long-term facility. I get called to receive a report for a patient that was being sent to us. I'm reading through the notes, and at the very end, quote-unquote, parents report patient repeatedly says that the devil comes at 3:33. I check the name to see if it's the same girl. It wasn't. I called the on-call physician, and he immediately declined the patient. To this day, all the staff have no idea what happened. A couple of years ago, me and my pops decided to go on a road trip. It was very out of the blue. I wasn't even expecting it, but I decided to go anyways. It would be some solid father-son bonding time. After driving for what seemed like a couple of hours, was around maybe 8 to 9 p.m., we pulled into this gas station for snacks, water, and to use the bathroom, and we went back inside of our car. Keep in mind, this gas station was basically in the middle of nowhere. Anyways, we got back into our car and decided to look for a motel, but there was none. And I mean not a single one anywhere near us. My dad was really tired, so we just decided to go to sleep in the vehicle. We pulled up into this sort of resting area / parking lot and decided to pass out for the night. My dad fell fast asleep, but I was on my phone for a couple more hours, and around 11 p.m. I just felt suffocated by the tense air and decided to step out for a bit. I felt safe because the gas station was still in sight, and there would be a couple of trucks that would occasionally drive by, so I was at ease. At the time, I was also texting my friend who lives in Seattle, Washington. We were on the phone for a little while. Then I saw what looked like a large cornfield, and I had never actually seen a cornfield in real life, so I decided to cross the road and just get a closer look. That's exactly what I did. I got extremely close, and I started feeling like I was being watched, but again I just thought, well, you're literally outside in the dark, standing next to a tall cornfield, of course you're going to feel this way. So I just brushed it off. I even considered going in, but I thought, why would I even do that? So anyways, I just decided to take a step back when I noticed a barn. It was a large, white barn with red, maybe black stripes. It was hard to tell in the dark, but it was definitely a barn. I was stupid and young when this happened, maybe 14 or 15. Out of curiosity, I decided to go check it out, and the barn was next to the cornfield, sort of tucked in a little. I literally thought, haha, I wish I could see something that would freak me out, as a joke, because I never really thought that anything would happen, and I love being scared. Anyways, I started making my way toward the barn. As I was getting closer and closer, I remembered very vividly that I was wearing no socks, just slip-on slides. I remember the dirt rubbing against my toes as I stepped. I remember sending pictures to my friend in Washington. I jokingly was saying that I saw something and that I was going to check it out. As I got closer, I saw something. It was behind the barn, but sort of off to the side, like how when someone peers around a corner. I thought it was a bell. Literally, I assumed that it was a bell attached to the corner of the barn, so I just walked a little closer. Even as I'm writing this, I am getting goosebumps. I walked closer and saw the head of someone or something just peering around the corner at me. At that moment, I just straight up froze. My fight or flight was out of function because there I was literally seeing someone or something peering at me. After about 5 to 10 seconds, the noise that Snapchat makes when you get a notification snapped me out of it, and I just ran as fast as I could across the road to my dad's car and got in. I felt a sense of relief wash over my body. Somehow my dad was not awake. Me gasping for air wasn't enough to wake him from his deep sleep. I really considered waking him up and telling him what I saw and that we had to leave, but he would just assume that I was joking or having an episode. Which sounds dumb, but he's assumed that before, since he never has believed in anything paranormal or anything out of the ordinary related. I took deep breaths and just texted my friend telling her what I saw, and even she didn't believe me. I don't blame her. And I wouldn't blame any of you either. Sometimes I have a hard time actually believing what I saw. But I know that it was real. I was sober and fully aware. But from the bottom of my heart, the part that disturbs me the most is that whatever was peering at me from around that corner was very tall. At least 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and every time I think about this, I get a sense of dread and paranoia. I haven't told any of my family or my dad, but if any of you have a clue as to what I might have seen, please let me know. Again, I wasn't hallucinating. This was before I even figured out anything about psychedelics or drugs in general. Please let me know if you have any ideas or info. Also, it probably sounds fake because if someone came to me telling me what I'm saying, I would also just rule it out to be fake. But please, I've been trying to piece it together for the last couple of months. I was sort of 50-50 on paranormal encounters, but after that experience, I believe. I believe in walkers to wendigos. I believe in ghosts to La Llorona. It has changed me, knowing what's out there. And everyone wants to believe, oh yeah, ghosts aren't real. But I feel like they are deep down. We know that there is some messed up stuff out there in this world. And I happened to encounter something. I want to begin my story by telling you first and foremost, I do not believe in the supernatural. I have never witnessed a ghost, spirit, entity, or malevolent force of nature. I have never encountered a poltergeist, demon, or an angel. I am not here to state the validity of anyone else's experiences, only my own. I do, however, believe in things that are good and things that are evil. Is it supernatural? I'm not here to prove that one way or the other. My story begins when I was 20 years old. I was in college, and like most college students, I was rebellious, wild, and carefree. I was eager to obtain a part-time job. I wanted my own spending money. And coming from a very small community with very little businesses, I was pretty much out of luck. My sister, who is 7 years older than me, was newly married with a baby, my nephew, and she worked at our hospital, the only hospital in our hometown. She was an RN, and trying to establish a good foundation of employment, so she had to take swing shifts before she could set her own hours. Her husband was working the night shift, so they needed someone to care for my nephew on the weekends. I jumped at the opportunity because I loved my nephew and I was good with him. He knew me and was a joy as a baby. I wasn't very popular in college, and had very few friends, so having something to do on the weekends brightened my mood somewhat. I started keeping my nephew on the following weekend. It was Friday, February 2nd, 1990.
I had just put my nephew to bed and had myself a beer and a cigarette out on the back porch of my sister's home. Yes, I was smoking and had one beer. Get over it. It was the 90s, for pity's sake. There were no cell phones, computer with internet games, or chatting, so when I say it was quiet, it was very quiet. They lived on Highway 322 outside of Clarksdale, Mississippi, and there were not many homes on this road at the time, and also very little traffic. I was reading a book, but halfway through the chapter I was reading, you could have heard a pin drop. The crickets stopped chirping. The wind literally stopped blowing. The mockingbird that I heard calling was silent, and the air suddenly felt so heavy that it became very difficult to breathe. I got up, opened the door to step outside down the steps, and as I'm frantically looking around trying to figure out what the heck is happening, the transformer next to the house explodes. Both streetlights go out, and I can smell burning rubber and plastic. I jumped so badly that I felt my heart catch in my throat, and the sound was deafening with sparks flying everywhere, looking almost like fireworks on the 4th of July. I couldn't hear the monitor to my nephew's room anymore. I realized the power had gone out in the house. That's when I rushed in to make sure he was still sleeping and not freaking out in the pitch black of night. He was perfectly safe, still sleeping peacefully and totally unaware of my miniature meltdown. Just as I was leaving his bedroom, I heard a noise that I still have no explanation for. The sound was a close relation to that of a child crying or a woman screaming. Now believe me when I tell you, I am a country girl, lived in the country most of my life, and I know what a panther sounds like. I've heard it many times. But this was nothing like that. It even resembled the sound of a dying cat, or any animal that may be close to death. Incoherent whimpering, a slight cackle here and there, and then silence. The sound sent a chill right up my spine, making me feel lightheaded and weak. I do not scare easily. I consider myself brave and rational, but all of that departed, leaving me feeling dizzy and nauseous. The sound was not coming from inside the house, but outside, close to the porch, right where I had been sitting. I knew this because I left the screen door open, and standing there motionless looking out the door, I knew it was out there somewhere. I waited a few moments, then I reached for my sister's baseball bat that she kept next to the door. She wasn't a fan of guns or knives, and neither was I, but that bat brought no comfort knowing I would have to get as close as possible to this thing in order to hit it with any amount of force. Trying to find the courage to walk out that door, believing it was only an animal brought no solace to me, but I'm tough, and I would do whatever it took to protect my nephew and myself. I stepped out onto the porch and heard nothing. I grabbed the flashlight hanging next to the porch door, clicked it on, and proceeded to look around. I slowly advanced toward the outside of the door, opened it, and walked slowly, very cautiously down the steps. My heart is pounding, and the only sound I hear is the air leaving and entering my lungs. I feel dizzy and start sweating from fear and adrenaline pumping through me like wildfire. Behind my sister's house, there's nothing but wooded forest and empty fields. Being February, there isn't much going on in the farming community. I make my way to the edge of the field and I hear it again. That dying animal sound. A screech, and then what I can only describe as tearing flesh, or perhaps paper. I have no idea at this point what I'm hearing. I shine the flashlight towards the noise, and what I saw still haunts me to this day. There were glowing red eyes staring right back at me, and in that instant I knew that it wasn't any kind of animal that I had ever heard, seen, or known about. Animal eyes do not glow red when you point a light at them. They're either orange or bright yellow, almost white. Just as I'm about to take a step back, a rush of wind blows past me and I see wings. Yes, wings. These wings are at least 50 to 60 feet in width, far too big for an owl, buzzard, or any other type of bird in that area.
When it opened up its wings, the rush of wind almost knocked me off my feet. It had the body of a man and the eyes of a demon, and was enveloped in jet black. I stood there shaking, trying to rationalize what I was looking at, and not believing 1 minute of it. My hands began to tremble, and I felt as though I was about to faint. It stood up, and with one quick whoosh, it shot up in the air and then out of sight. My mind raced. What did I just see? What just happened? What was that thing? The moon was out that night, so I saw it shoot straight up and disappear quick and almost with no sound at all. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the area in which I live, but on that very night, the Parker family was brutally murdered, not an hour after I had seen whatever it was that I witnessed. A family of 4 had come home, walked in on 4 burglars, and were tied up, raped, sodomized, and burned alive. Their house was burned to the ground, and the 4 men who committed this heinous act are still thriving. The justice system in this area rarely sees true justice. After that night, I started researching possibilities on what I had seen, and each time my research led me back to none other than the Mothman. The folklore that surrounds this creature is a sign, an omen of things to come, a tragedy. Something so evil, you cannot even imagine what it could be. This is the first time I have ever shared this, typed it out, trying to remember the little details, and I'm still convinced that what I saw that night was the angel of death, Mothman, Lucifer himself. Who knows? But I do know what I saw, and I believe with my whole heart that that entity was a prelude to the unimaginable crime being committed that night. I do not believe it appeared to warn me in particular, but ever since I saw it that night, my research has revealed that far more people than me have seen this creature. An entire town, villages, people who have seen this creature right before an accident or traumatic event. Again, I do not believe in the supernatural, but I do believe in evil, and what I saw that night was the epitome of pure evil. I could feel it, smell it, and almost taste it. It exuded evil to the extent that I was almost taken over by it, making me feel so physically ill that I could not shake it off. The next morning when I learned of the murders, which incidentally were only about half a mile from my sister's house, I had that same feeling. Dread, nausea, and a burning in my stomach. I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. It made me so violently ill. I'm sure many will tell me that what I saw was nothing more than some rare bird or something that can be logically explained. But I know in my gut, my heart, and my soul what I saw. It was not of this world, and quite frankly, I never want to see it again.
This last Halloween, I didn't have many friends. Only 2 at the time who wanted to celebrate together. One eventually bailed, leaving me and my friend Rob to hang out alone. It was freezing, and I had to bike out to our usual rendezvous place, which was about equidistance from our houses. This place was a gas station adjacent to a very large field that was occasionally used for soccer games. Once we both arrived to the gas station, we went inside, got water and sunflower seeds, and left. Due to the pandemic, we decided not to risk exposure by trick-or-treating, so we went to go walk in this field. It was around 9:30 at night, and pitch black outside. We don't live near any major cities, so our only light was from the moon and the stars. The sky was clear that night, so around 5 minutes in, we became entranced by the stars in the sky, walking forward with our heads craned back, looking up. This went on for a minute or 2 before we thought we heard shuffling near us. We turned to the right to see a dark figure, lit very dimly by the extraterrestrial light. I'm a rather small person, and Rob isn't too much bigger, so the littlest things normally will put us on edge. But this thing was different. It looked bipedal, though it seemed to be bent over with a near hunched back. And there were protrusions from its head. Either horns or ears, it was difficult to tell. I immediately emitted a short scream and ran to the side toward Rob. I knew he occasionally carried a hunting knife, as he's more of an outback type of person than me. The thing then bent down to walk on all fours and started yipping strangely, like a small dog almost. My friend grabbed the back of my jacket and yanked me back and yelled at me to run. He then pulled out the hunting knife. The creature was pacing while still making strange noises. It looked like it was about to get closer before Rob threw the knife at the thing and got up to run. He yelled an exasperated "shit" as he started to sprint away. As we ran, I heard a voice repeatedly echo Rob's, also saying "shit." We ran all the way back to the gas station and to where we parked our bikes. Wordlessly, we decided it was best to just go inside the brightly lit station and just wait for our nerves to calm down. We haven't been able to hang out since due to the virus, but I doubt that we will go walking in that field at night again.
I'm an OTR truck driver, which means that I drive across the country multiple times in a month-long period. I'd like to share a story with you. On a dark July night around 2 a.m., I was headed south on US 93 highway in Nevada. I was approximately 30 miles north off of Las Vegas. Traffic was scarce. I had not seen a single vehicle for at least 40 minutes. The only source of light that illuminated the road were the truck headlights. I was on the phone with a friend of mine just chatting about random stuff when in the distance about 300 feet ahead of me I saw something on the shoulder of the road. At first I thought it might have been a turned over construction sign or a bag of some sort. But as I was approaching the object, I started to make out some features. It was a human-like figure, I thought. Just to be clear, that area is deserted and there's absolutely nothing to be found within a 25-mile radius. When I was about 5 yards away, I could see it clearly. It was a boy. He was around 8 to 10 years old, I'd say. He had a school backpack and a white plush bunny in his right arm held tightly against his chest. He was just standing there with his cold stare, completely unemotional, looking me directly in the eyes. He didn't break the stare as I passed him. He didn't even blink or flinch, and let me remind you that it's an 80,000-pound semi-truck moving at 65 miles an hour. My heart was racing. My whole body was covered in goosebumps. A cold chill went down my spine. I don't think that I have ever been so disturbed in my life since I've never had any paranormal encounters. Once I passed him, the first thing that came to my mind was that if I see him appear again a couple of miles ahead, I'm gonna have a heart attack. But thankfully, it never happened. The rest of the trip was uneventful. I still don't know what it was. I'm not trying to claim that it was a ghost or the spirit of a deceased child. I just can't find any adequate explanation to it. It was definitely not a hallucination since I was wide awake and talking on the phone. It just seems weird to me. What in the world was a 10-year-old kid doing by himself in the middle of a desert? While going through a tough time in my relationship, I decided to move in with my mom for a few months for a break from the chaos. A guy I had met through a mutual friend of ours offered to pick me up in his truck and take us for a drive through the mountain trails behind my mother's house. Bored out of my mind with TV and food, I agreed. He arrived, I got in. We drove to the top of the ridge at the beginning of one of the trails where we stopped to roll up really quick. 5 or 10 minutes later, we were slowly driving along, listening to music, talking, laughing, realizing that we had actually been neighbors years before. The song on the truck radio was changing, and there began a softer song. We could hear the wind blowing quietly through the trees, and all of a sudden there was a whisper. "She's with him," the voice said, extremely clearly. I did not know what to do. I mean, what were they talking about? And even more importantly, who were they? We continued to drive down a trail a bit longer because my guy friend said it would be bad not to show dominance to whatever it was and not to run scared, ever. But it was, in fact, the scariest moment of my life. I should clarify also that this is in the middle of nowhere in the middle of nowhere. My mom has no neighbors for miles. Hunters are allowed on the property, but none were in the area. We shined headlights in the direction of the whisper, and there was nothing. For about 2 years now at my childhood home, there has been something in the woods around it. They've built in the span of 2 years a house where the woods used to be, but it only seems to have made whatever is there more active. So for backstory, 2 years ago I was with my dog taking him out to go pee. He was being agitated and skittish, which is very unlike him. He's a Chow Shepherd mix, and he's as much a protector as any other dog, so his attitude this night in particular had me on edge as well. I went to join him when I heard him growling, so I stepped out to the side of the house, hearing him absolutely lose it. For a bit of setting, there's a fence around the length of our backyard that also goes about halfway up the sides of the house. The fence has a gate on either side of the house, and there are trees and overgrowth also on either side of the house. As I step out of the door, I notice something moving in the tree line, so I quickly step back inside. We have a baseball bat for protection, and I went to get that and came back. My dog was still losing it, and was staring at the thing I had seen, and had not moved. He was growling, snarling, and his ears were pinned and his tail was tucked. Something was really, really messing with him. So I go down the side fence, letting the bat clink along the chain link, making sure whoever was there knew that I was armed. I'm 5'4" and look really soft or easy to take on, but I can bench 200 pounds and am not afraid. I'm also a bit of an idiot. But I'm not unused to scary things, so I was more annoyed than scared, really. That changed very quickly, though. I stood right behind my dog and looked at this figure, which was still standing dead in place. I considered that there was nothing there, but I wouldn't know until I double-checked. I called out to the figure, telling the person I assumed was there that they needed to get off of private property. They were on my soon-to-be neighbor's land, and I was afraid they had been messing around in the construction process. Honestly, I assumed it was just some teenager. But then I heard an owl coo, and I'll be honest, we don't have many of them here where I live. I sort of feel this cold, damp dread spread across my body, and I hesitate, but I pull my phone out and flash the flashlight. I kind of wish I hadn't. Standing there was a figure, which was ridiculously tall, I'll say 8 to 10 feet, and thin and wiry. It was in all black, something like a hooded robe. It looked heavy, and it didn't hang naturally. I couldn't tell the physical size of the body of this thing because it was so heavily cloaked, but its face was the thing that really threw me for a loop. It had the face of an owl. I don't know what kind of owl, but the big black eyes, the beak, the round moon face, and it clearly had a pale tan face, and the dark brown feathers around the edges of it. It did not blink or move when the light hit it. It continued to just stand there. I could see the rise and fall of its chest. My dog barked for the first time with the light on it, and quickly I turned off the light and moved back inside. I'm a practicing witch, so after that I quickly worked on protections for the house, my dog, and me, and also did a cleansing because I felt almost electrocuted. I've seen it twice since this first time, and my mother has seen it a few times too. She hypothesizes that it's angry about the new construction on the land, and I think it's a warning. I was with my niece, who's on her high school soccer team and is taking it pretty serious and attempting to get some kind of scholarship out of it. I'm pretty healthy, but don't really work out too much. Something I often do is run and hike. I live in Kentucky, not in a rural part, but there is a state park near my house that's about 6,500 acres, so it's pretty secluded and densely forested. There are some really nice trails that allow you to run for a good chunk and then hike for a bit to split up the long bits of the trail that are flat. She decided to tag along with me today for a quick 3 or 4 mile run. It was raining, but nothing too heavy, kind of a spitting rain. Nothing we couldn't handle. We got up to the peak of this one hill, and it had been about 2 miles or so according to our phones, so we decided to turn back and head back to the car. As we were headed down the steep side of the climb, we were walking pretty slow, making sure that we didn't lose our footing, when out of nowhere there was the coldest chill that came up from behind us once we made it about halfway down. At the time it happened, we both commented on how cold it was on our backs, but didn't make too much out of it and went on with our conversation. In these woods there's some wildlife like small deer and I believe maybe some coyotes, but they tend to stay away from the paths. At least I've only ever heard them in my many years of coming here, never once seen any more than a few footprints. Once we got off of the hillside and hit a stretch of trail that was flatter ground, we began to pick up the pace when a deer darted across the path maybe 10 yards max in front of us, causing us to stop in our tracks. The first deer was then followed by 3 more, and not one of them even so much as looked our way. My niece looked at me puzzled because of the oddity of it. And to me, they were acting as if they were running from something, a predator of some sort. Once they had gone, we started back with our run, and we heard a noise behind us. A loud booming sound of something of substance falling to the ground from some height. When we stopped and turned, we saw nothing. No animal scurrying away like one would expect after a substantial noise in the wilderness. In fact, everything was calm, eerily calm. Just as we looked at each other to ask what the hell that had been, there was yet another cold wind gush through the valley, pushing all the rain off the leaves surrounding us and soaking our sweatshirts. I was starting to freak out inside, but was doing my best to stay calm for my 17-year-old niece. I'm pretty sure she could tell, though, that I was freaked out. I tell her, "Come on, let's get to the car." And we take off again, and there was a man leaned up against a tree on the side of the trail, dressed in a black suit with a white button-up shirt on. His collar was opened, but he had a tie on, sagging like a tired businessman on the way home from a long day. It startled me at first. I was not expecting to see anyone for a few reasons, one being that we were at least a mile away from any parking lot or street, another being that we had never heard or seen him coming, and the stretch of trail that we were on was flat and open for a good half mile. I got over to put myself between the man and my niece as we jogged past him. When we did, I looked him in the eye and gave him a "how you doing" nod as we went along. He was sort of pale. His eyes were very white, but his irises were ice blue. Everything I saw from the quick look that I got close up looked to be clean-cut and proper. I did not notice a speck of mud on him anywhere, and the two of us had it caked on the bottom of our shoes and even on the back of our pants and shirts from kicking it up on us as we ran. We had to get to the top of another hill, smaller than the last, but still quite the hike. Once at the top, I took a quick look behind us, and he had seemed to vanish without a trace. Now, with having the vantage point of the hill, I could see out past the trail and see most of the trail that she and I had just come from. yet he was nowhere in sight. I scanned the sides of the trail, and still nothing. My niece asked me who that guy was and why he was out so deep in the woods wearing a suit. Questions I simply did not have the answers to. We made it back to the car with nothing else out of the ordinary happening to us on the trail. As we got to my car, I pulled the keys from my pocket and unlocked the doors from maybe about 10 feet out. Walking up to the only car in the entire lot, I noticed muddy footprints coming away from my car from the driver's side. Weird, considering I had no mud on my shoes when we got there. But there are trails leading up to the lot, so I figured maybe someone had came through before we got there and I just didn't notice. However, when I pulled the handle to open the door, it was also caked with mud underneath, as if someone had been attempting to open my door with a muddy hand. Nothing more occurred, but the whole encounter leaves chills covering my body the more I think about it. The first and only time I've ever seen a ghost, a dead person, a demon, whatever you want to call it, was exactly 1 year ago today. I had just gotten my bachelor after 3 years of studying social welfare and was now working at a group home for teens with substance use problems. My workplace was in a big old house, which was almost scary quiet during the nighttime, and I often felt anxious being there. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoyed the job and spending time with the teens, but working nights scared the crap out of me. I usually started my shift around 8 p.m. Around that time we often made dinner. I helped out with homework, and we talked for hours dealing with all sorts of issues until I went to bed, usually around 1 a.m., and this was one of those days. I fell asleep at 1:30, woke up 2 hours later like I usually do to get a glass of water. I walked down the stairs, entered the common room, and then walked by a big window in the living room. I looked up at the gray, cloudy sky when I saw death hanging in a tree. Brown, rotten flesh in the shape of a face. I rubbed my eyes, and then looked again, and the flesh was still there. I couldn't move, breathe, or blink my eyes for a few seconds. I was absolutely terrified. After a while, I found the strength to move my legs and walked into the office again. I locked the door and sat there all night, and when the sun finally peeked out, I managed to move my legs to go and look out the window again. There was no rotten flesh this time, just a normal tree with green leaves. A few days later after this incident, I told my boss that I didn't want to work night shifts anymore since the lack of sleep. I didn't want to tell her the real reason, since she would probably think that I was mad. Maybe I was. And what if this was just a nightmare? Probably. But what if it wasn't?
Last year, I was living in a small mountain town in central southern Colorado in the Rio Grande National Forest. Super small town. Ute natives were tragically killed in the whole area. I don't usually get creepy vibes when I'm there, but it's definitely weird in many ways. I was in my car at 2 a.m. with a friend. We were parked outside our house looking down the road with the only streetlight across the street lighting up the area. From 15 yards in front of us, we see a large animal emerge from darkness and catch the light. We started asking each other what it was, commenting on its size. It was like the size of a small horse or a big deer. It walked toward us. It stood 1 yard away from my door. We were frozen. We were unable to move, and we just stared at it with it so close to us, and I said, "Is that a wolf?" It's all I could think that it could be. It was tall, completely silver. It looked like a wolf from a movie. As it stood there, it looked up to the sky, and then left, and then to the right. Then it ran away toward the large cliffs at the back of the town where the abandoned mines are, and a large forest begins. We were stunned. We stayed frozen and silent for minutes until we just started laughing. We eventually calmed down and went inside, but were confused as hell. After that, I told some coworkers, thinking how cool it was, that I saw a wolf. They all said that it was impossible, that no wolves had lived there for decades. So I do some research, and they're right. No wolves have been here for like 40 years, and it would be a miracle if I had seen one, especially a gray wolf. As I look at more pictures of wolves, my memory becomes clearer. What I saw was too tall and silver to even be a gray wolf. My friend and I have not forgotten one detail of this story. I'm sure it wasn't a dog. If it was, then that was the biggest dog in existence. I remember the world washing away as I stared at its shining fur. It was possibly the most majestic animal I have ever seen. There were chills covering my body, and I could barely breathe. Do you think that I saw a skinwalker?
So the area is deep in the Monongahela Forest in Virginia. I was doing some hiking there alone, trying to explore the new area, seeing what's out there. Everything was going pretty smooth in general, except for one occurrence that had gotten me blown away completely. By the way, I'm a 37-year-old male, been hiking in forests and mountains many times, never had an issue. Anyway, so I'm walking in the forest. It was around 4 p.m. I was alone. I had everything on me, including a radio beacon, compass, GPS on my phone, and smartwatch. So as you can see, taking my precautions in case I get lost, so that I can figure out my whereabouts and get back. I also even had printed maps on me. While walking, I all of a sudden felt some sort of weird, very weird quietness. As if you know it was the vacuum. No birds chirping, just quietness. And what's extra weird about it was that it was so quiet that I could hear the humming in my ears that you sometimes get to hear in total silence. I'm thinking, okay, quite odd. First, though, is that there might have been a predator in the vicinity, so I was trying to keep an eye out for that. I did carry something to protect myself with just in case I got attacked. Anyway, I just keep walking. No predator, but the quietness was just there. It's strange. I did not even see any birds anymore, just trees. I also noticed that the weather started getting worse, it became cloudy in an odd way. I don't know how to explain it. Long story short, the weather got bad pretty much out of nowhere. At this point, I kind of started feeling I don't know how to describe it, I guess uneasiness. I decided to go back, and here's this. All of a sudden, the GPS is out on both my phone and my smartwatch, and the compass is spinning as if there's a magnet close by or something like that. That got me very concerned because it pretty much means that I can't find out where to go in case I get lost. I started walking back. None of my navigational tools are working. I'm kind of still going back, just kind of orienting myself by the way that I came in. All of a sudden, I see the clouds above are really bizarre. It's like most of the clouds are weird and grayish in color, but they're not like clouds, but more kind of like fog, which is really way up. Then there was another cloud kind of surrounded by gray clouds, which was black. I've never seen a cloud look like that before. It was almost like the night sky. Then the craziness happened. All of a sudden, I hear music. Like a town clock bell or something like that, doing it every 10 seconds or so. I don't know, at the time I just got scared, really freaked out, and I just started running very, very fast back where I had come from. I was sprinting, and then eventually I noticed that the weather got better. It was no longer cloudy. The clouds weren't in fact visible anywhere near.
I looked at my compass and GPS, and it was back up. I was, in fact, headed in the correct direction. After that, I just went back to the place where I had parked and left. Later that day, I looked up the weather forecast for that area. There wasn't supposed to be any cloudiness anywhere. It was supposed to be a sunny day with only sporadic clouds. I told my story to my buddies, also hikers. They say it might have been that I could have maybe fallen and maybe had a dream of that, but I don't think so because I don't remember falling or having a dream. Anyways, it's kind of a weird story. Maybe there's a logical explanation, but I don't know.
For a little backstory, my partner and I have been dating for about a year and a half. This February, I was given tickets as a birthday gift to finally visit him, as I'm in Scotland. Experience 1. I spent the middle of February over in Arizona visiting my partner. While we're both interested in the paranormal, I believe in it all, having had multiple experiences, whereas he tends to just humor me, not believing in it much himself. He's never mentioned anything odd happening in his apartment, but I saw, heard, and felt small things the first couple of days that I was there. One morning in particular at around 4 a.m. I was on the sofa playing on my phone, jet lag, when I looked up and saw a figure standing over him as he slept. It was similar to a shadow person phenomenon, just a dark humanoid shape, but it felt nasty. When I saw it, it turned almost as if it was startled to see someone else in the room. Never mind, someone who could also see it. It did sort of a double take and then disappeared, but the energy in the room felt off. I performed a cleansing ritual that I've come to rely on when negative energies are bothering me. For the remainder of my trip, the apartment felt light and airy, with the exception of later that day when I was taking a nap and felt what I thought was my partner standing over me watching me sleep. I opened my eyes and felt the negative presence over me, as though trying to work out who I was and why I was there. It was then told in very clear terms that it wasn't welcome, whether I was there or not, and it cleared out. No more issues, so that was fine. Experience 2. My partner's friends, another couple, really helped in making me feel welcome, and the 4 of us went out on road trips a couple of times, once to Jerome and another to a recreational spot by a lake. I felt a little funny anytime we were driving around near or on the reservations, as though the native spirits were very much aware of us going through their land, but nothing felt bad, just sort of a curiosity. But one instance in particular sticks out. While driving toward Phoenix after a day at the lake, we were all chatting away in the car when we got into reservation territory. I got that not alone feeling again, but still, it was curious, though this time it was more intense. There was a lull in the conversation, and I was just admiring the landscape as the sun was going down, when in the middle of the center embankment on the road, there was a figure that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. I know it was male, and I know that he was a Native American. Nothing felt wrong, but when I asked if anyone else had seen him, they all said no, despite the fact that, as far as I was concerned, you couldn't miss him. He was old, tall, and completely white. His clothes, hair, everything, with an aura of hazy light around him, simply standing and watching over the road. I don't know who he was, but it felt like he was watching over the people traveling through his land. It was comforting. I'd like to start this off by saying that I'm an absolute skeptic, to the point where I've always secretly scoffed about paranormal activities. But I can't explain this. I met my husband in a little dive bar that he was managing. We clicked instantly, and he's a very outdoorsy guy. We got together a couple times, then he officially asked me out on an overnight hike. I had a 10-month-old St. Bernard pup, who of course came with. We drove up way past Cougar towards Mount St. Helens and parked on the trailhead leading to Bolt Camp. It's just a little shelter along the Lewis River about 5 to 6 miles in. We packed all our gear, and even a backpack for my dog, and headed out. I can't stress how beautiful that hike is. Massive Douglas firs covered with moss. Sometimes there were little wooden bridges crossing streams along the trail. My husband would always yell, "Watch out for trolls," when we crossed them. We got kind of a late start, so the sun went down and it was almost completely dark by the time that we arrived. There were so many hollow stumps the setting sun would shine through them, and they lit up inside. They looked like little hobbit houses with fires burning in their hearths. And the mushrooms, my God, there were bioluminescent ones that glowed green in the dark. It took forever. He kept saying that it was around the next bend, but it never was. We finally arrived and unpacked, and it was awesome. You can look up Bolt Camp online. It's a wooden 3-sided shelter. You'll even see my saint in one of those pics. A tree had come down on it at some point, and the pics you see of it partially smashed are how it was for us. It was still more than intact enough to sleep in, though. People leave stuff at Bolt Camp for the next folks. Someone had left half a bottle of scotch. We partook in that, and when we left, we hung a little baggie of weed from the rafters and some beer and water. Anyway, we made a fire and cooked steaks on rocks, got drunk, and fell in love. I fell asleep first. I slept towards the inside of the shelter, my now husband and dog toward the outside. It was late October, and while it was dry, it was very, very cold, and the fire refused to stay lit. Eventually, he fell asleep too. My Saint Leo kept growling into the dark, and they bonded over that. "What do you see, buddy? What's out there?" They were both asleep when I woke up. Thinking it was around 2:30 to 3 a.m., I was facing the back wall of the shelter. Then I saw it. A wispy, gossamer, cobweb-looking thing floating to and fro in the back of the shelter. It would flip and spin and turn over itself. It was so beautiful and fascinating. I wasn't scared. I really, really wanted to wake him up, but I barely knew the dude and was afraid he would think I was nuts. So I watched it until I fell asleep. Morning came. I never mentioned it. We fed the dog, ate a bunch of trail mix and cheese and sausage, and hiked back. I dropped him off at his place. Like I said, we fell in love that night, and moved in together a couple months later. We were reminiscing about our awesome hike when he decided to share something with me. I dropped him off that day at his house. That same evening, he was out on his porch having a smoke when he saw something. A cobwebby thing, turning over and over on itself, floating back and forth in the street lamps. He found this interesting. He watched it, and finally it settled into a clump of bushes. He went to take a closer look, and a pair of glowing red eyes materialized, and he decided that he wanted no part, and ran back indoors. This is a man afraid of nothing. Anyway, I obviously immediately told him about what I had seen, and how I was too embarrassed to share before. The similarities are just too great. It had to have been the same thing. This happened on a hike up to Half Dome. We had a campground about a 20-minute drive away from the trailhead, and the group was composed of me, an 18-year-old male, my uncle, a 32-year-old male, and my uncle's friend, I'll call him D. There were 2 girls with us, but they aren't relevant to the story. My uncle and his friend are both Christians, so there were no substances consumed that could induce the feelings I will be talking about. We get to our campsite, set up camp, and go to sleep after eating. We plan to wake up at 4 and start to hike by 4:30. I randomly wake up at 3:30 a.m., like completely wide awake, and look out of my hammock, and I remember this odd feeling as if I was woken up by something. I remember looking out at the moonlit scene. The moon was very bright for some reason, and thinking to myself that it looks like a dream. I lay back in the hammock, but can't go to sleep, and end up waking up my uncle and friend at 3:50. My uncle asks me, "Were you walking around at night?" This is important, and I say no and ask why. He says that he woke up for some reason and could hear someone walking around, not like an animal, but a person. I say, "Huh, weird," and we brush it off. We get to the trailhead around 4:30, and as everyone is unloading from the car, Dee says that he's going to use the bathroom, which there are a couple of before the trailhead. I walk behind him for some time before falling behind and waiting for my uncle, who forgot something in the car. The short, straight road from the parking lot runs directly into a T intersection with the road to the trailhead, and the bathroom is directly across from the intersection through a field a little. Those who have been there know what I'm talking about. We get to the intersection and wait for Dee to come out of the bathroom. We wait about 10 minutes before I go and check, and he isn't there. I get back to my uncle and tell him that. He says, "Weird, maybe he went back to the car or something," and we decide to wait a bit more. By 5:10, we begin worrying. My uncle goes to check the car while I wait at the intersection to make sure that we don't miss him if he went down the road away from the trailhead. My uncle returns and says he isn't there either. We decide maybe he went up the trailhead without us for some reason and walk up in there for about 10 minutes. He isn't there either. We're kind of baffled now because there are no other logical places he would go. I decide to run back and check the car and the bathroom again. I meet him halfway before I get to the intersection. He is sweaty and disheveled with a weird look in his eyes. I say, "Where have you been?" He says that he went to the bathroom, and when he got back to the intersection that we weren't there, and that he just assumed that we went to the trailhead and started walking, and then met me. I say, "What do you mean? We waited at the intersection for over half an hour and checked at the car, bathroom, and trailhead, and you weren't there." He says, "Well, I don't know. I went to the bathroom." He then asks me where my uncle is. I say at the trailhead, and he asks me again. I tell him again and note that it was weird that he was asking me twice. As we were crossing the bridge to the trailhead, he sees a light off the riverbank and exclaims, "Oh, maybe that's him," and I just look at him and keep walking. I thought his behavior was very strange, like he wasn't thinking straight. We finally get on with the hike, and it goes by as normal, except that we seem to keep losing things, such as my uncle's small red flashlight, one of the girls' gloves, a water bottle, etc. It's like we simply just forgot about the items and couldn't remember where we possibly could have left them. On the way back, it got dark, and we turned on our flashlights, and as we near the end of the hike after the 2 waterfalls, it begins to seem as if we've been walking for too long. My uncle also confirms this, asking me, "Doesn't it seem like it's taken way longer to get back?" I say, "Yeah, that I was just thinking that." We keep walking, but it still seems like we weren't making any progress. I've been on that trail many times, and as I was walking, I couldn't spot any of the familiar landmarks. It was weird. There was this odd feeling in the air, sort of a slight menacing sensation. It's hard to describe. I remember thinking, it feels like the woods are alive. We remark 3 more times about how long the hike is taking, and start to laugh at it because it felt so ridiculous. After a bit, we finally, and suddenly, find ourselves on the final stretch, and make it back to the car. Now all of this seemed odd at the time, but I just brushed it off. I only just realized how weird those events felt after we got home and my aunt asks my uncle, "Were you camping?" And he says, "Yeah, how did you know?" As we didn't tell them we were going, since it was kind of last minute. She said that she had an odd dream, where she saw my uncle in a tent in a forest somewhere, and there was someone outside of his tent. She said that she couldn't see who it was, but knew that there was a presence there. She says that she woke up around 3 and had the strongest urge to pray for him. And she did. My uncle kind of looks at me after hearing that like, are you serious? I honestly don't know what to make of all of this. This began in January of this year. I live on the Front Range of Colorado, meaning that once the mountains stop, it's basically plains for miles and miles. There are a lot of small roads and strange dead ends around these parts, and one of these is a favorite of me and my friends as it goes a long way out from the main road with basically no reason for anyone else to be there. This privacy is great for any variety of teenage shenanigans. Back in January, I was high as hell in the back of my friend's car as we drove down that road, hoping to park at the end so that we could smoke some more. As I was staring out the window, I swore that I could see the silhouette of a tall, strangely proportioned person running alongside our car. It was far out in the field, and I convinced myself that it was just my inebriated mind playing tricks on me so that I wouldn't freak out. And I didn't tell my friends so that it wouldn't bother them. We parked there for a few hours, lights off, and then went home with nothing else amiss. This actually makes me want to die now. Tonight I was headed back out to that spot with my girlfriend, both of us in separate cars. My drive up was pretty uneventful, but there was some fog that made it pretty spooky. Once we parked, my girlfriend hopped into my car and was obviously super freaked out. Once I got her to calm down, she told me what had happened. On the drive up, she looked out her window and saw a tall, dark figure, exactly like what I had seen 11 months ago, but this time, it was just standing there, staring. As soon as she made eye contact with it, her car radio turned to static. She pretty quickly turned it off and hauled ass to meet up with me. I cannot stress enough how little she believes in the supernatural, so seeing her as freaked out as she was definitely left me a little uneasy. I helped calm her down, and then hopped out of the car to take a piss. I know, literally the stupidest move ever, but at the time, I hadn't remembered what had happened to me previously, and I really had to pee. While I was out there, I definitely felt like something was watching me, but I'm a generally anxious person, so I brushed it off, as I was only going to be out there for like 30 seconds. When I stood up and went back to my door, my girlfriend looked absolutely terrified, and she was staring over my shoulder, not at me. My first thought wasn't anything supernatural. We're both girls, so I assumed that some creepy rapist had crawled out of the grass and was standing right behind me, waiting to hurt us. When I tell you I flew into the driver's seat, I really mean it. My flight reflex took 100% over. I slammed the door, looked over at her, and yelled, "What?" As far as I could tell, there wasn't anyone there. She told me that she had heard faint, female voices coming from the grass, exactly like ours. We were in an open plain, so there was no way that it was an echo. Whatever was out there was mimicking us. The mimicry is what did it for me, and I knew that we had to leave ASAP, especially as I had deciphered my hazy memories of the last time that I saw whatever it was. I didn't tell my girlfriend exactly what was wrong, just turned around so that my headlights were on her car so that she could get out there quickly. Once we were safely away, I called her and told her my thoughts. We're both incredibly spooked right now, obviously. It's been 4 or 5 years since my last encounter. I think I'm safe, right? Wrong. I moved last year and I recently thought, hey, remember those kids a few years ago? Funny, they can't get you now. Boy, was I ever incorrect. I live on a mountain, and like an hour away from the beach in a super populated neighborhood with my roommates. 2 chill lesbians and a college dude. Super cool people. I think nothing can hurt me now, because there are people everywhere. But no, I'm stupid and jinx myself. I was home 2 days ago. Class was canceled, and the dude of the house was home too and taking a nap. I'm in the kitchen watching Netflix and doing homework when there's a knock on the window. Obviously, this is weird as hell, but I have weird as hell friends. Maybe one of them are trying to scare me. I brush it off and continue what I was doing, and then it happens again. Once again, I brush it off because maybe it was the snow if it wasn't one of my friends. Things like this happen all the time with them. Well, it goes on for about 10 minutes, and I'm kinda starting to freak out. My friends don't have this much patience. I go to Charlie's room, the guy, and wake him up. I'm not the one that's usually riled up, so he's concerned too. We both go to the window. I have my phone out with the camera and 911 within a touch, and Charlie has a bat. We look out the window, and no one is there. After a minute, we calm down and go and sit in the living room. Charlie's mom is a cop, so he says he'll tell her about it later. We think we're okay, so we chill and watch TV together. 30 minutes later, the doorbell rings. I go and open the door. At first, I don't see anything. Then, down on the bottom of the stairs of the apartment, I see 3 young boys dressed in black hoodies, jeans, with brown or black bangs. At first, I didn't move. I was frozen in place. Then Charlie asked who it was, and I came to my senses and got a good look at the kids, then slammed the door shut behind me. I started bawling, and I mean sobbing. I had no clue what to do. Charlie's freaking out because I don't cry, especially in front of people like that. He ran to the door with the bat that we have on the windowsill and looked outside. He saw them too. He started freaking out because he didn't know what to do, so he started yelling at them to leave. He said they started smiling. I was crying even more now, and he was still screaming, and I think the neighbors wanted to call the cops. Now think about this. He didn't know what they were. He thought they were normal kids that had scared me. He didn't see their eyes yet. I started yelling at him to go inside when I hear a bunch of footsteps running up the stairs and Charlie screams and runs in. He's telling me he saw their eyes and that they were black, and now we're both freaking out and grabbing kitchen knives. Eventually we calm down and look outside again. No one's there, but we can see a group of kids past the complex with 3 that we think might have been the BEKs. I told him about the other thing that happened to me, and now we're scared to be in this house. We told the other roommates, and they thought we were high or something, so once again, no one believes me. This happened about 3 days ago, and I've been on edge ever since. My grandpa was always a big hunter. It's not uncommon here in the Midwest. He would always find new areas to hunt and get permission to hunt on private properties. So one day, him and his buddy got permission to go on this private land that I believe was around 100 acres total. I don't recall the specifics of exactly where the forest was. For now, I know for a fact that this was in the Michigan-Indiana border area, or in other words, Michiana. Anyways, they set out around noon to get to the forest and arrived at around 1 p.m. and started hiking back into the woods. They each had their own tree stands or blinds set up prior, so they made their way to them. I remember my grandpa telling me that they hiked a few miles back, so they had to have been deep in the woods. As the day goes on, they don't see any deer, so once the sun began to set, they decided to start making their way back to the truck and met up near my grandpa's tree stand. This is where the weird stuff happens. They're making their way back and the sun has completely set. Luckily, they brought flashlights for the walk back because otherwise they would have had to have walked a few miles in pitch black. Anyways, they finally have about a mile of hiking left when they see something or someone crouched in front of them with their back turned to them. My grandpa described him as a bald white guy wearing a black and white striped shirt. My grandpa's friend speaks up after a moment that I can only imagine as a "what the heck is this feeling?" and asks what he's doing out there, and without a word, the man stands up and faces them, stares,
then levitates up toward the trees and disappears. After that, they sprinted to the truck and never went back to that land again. I know it's not the craziest of stories and sounds so weird, but I know for a fact that my grandpa did experience this. My grandpa's not a liar, and it was never some scary campfire story that he told us grandkids. When he told me, I could see in his face that it was disturbing him, and is something that he can never forget.
It was 1999, and I worked night shift in a factory back in Puerto Rico. One night it was just a QC and me working in a back dark room of the factory. About 2:30 a.m. I saw a door open, and a pale young lady stepped in and walked in our direction. QC was facing the other way, and I was looking at her from my workstation. I stood up, and that's when I noticed that from the waist down, the woman was blurred. She was dressed in a light blue dress and a cap. As she got closer, she vanished into a mist. I rubbed my eyes and called the QC. I told her what I had just seen, and she said, "It's just your imagination playing tricks." After an hour or so had passed, this tall, dark shape, dressed in a brown mechanic's outfit, got close to me, looking over my right shoulder. I could see it with the edge of my eyes. It wasn't touching the floor. I froze, petrified. For about 30 minutes, it kept moving forward and backward. I finished the work night and went home spooked. Next day I told my experience to everyone, and a mechanic who had worked there for years told me that when he stayed there, an old mechanic who had all kinds of issues was found hung in the same spot where I was working. I totally forgot about this happening until my mom brought it up at dinner tonight, and now it's 9:30 at night and I'm scared all over again. This was back in high school, either my freshman or sophomore year. I missed the bus, and I didn't have a car at the time, so my mom had to drive me to school. The road my tiny neighborhood, more like a glorified cul-de-sac, was off of was a long stretch that had only one equally tiny other neighborhood and a few houses here and there. It was 6 a.m. or something and still dark outside, and it was colder than a witch's tit. As we were pulling out of the neighborhood, my mom and I both saw these 3 children in blue and white private school uniforms standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder at the entrance of the neighborhood on the sidewalk. It was either 2 girls and 1 boy or 2 boys and 1 girl. I didn't remember the ratio, but the girls wore a blue and white skirt/dress outfit and the boy wore a blue short-sleeved shirt with khaki shorts. This was weird for a few reasons. 1, it was 40 degrees outside. They looked like they were dressed for the summer, and they didn't even wear coats or anything. Secondly, there were 2 schools in the area, but not a private school till the next town over, and the blue and white weren't the school's uniform colors. Third, what young kids just stand there in a single file line not doing anything but staring? No joshing around, no nothing? Yeah, right. Lastly, this wasn't where the bus stop was. It was a few blocks down. Just a sprinkle of extra creepy on top. There weren't any streetlights. They were just standing there in the dark, not doing jack except for being creepy as hell. They were on the corner on the right, closest to the passenger side where I was obviously sitting. And of course, we were turning right. As we got closer, I thought that at first they didn't have faces, but it was just too shadowy and dark out, and the headlights only shone under their shoulders, which is how I can remember the outfits so vividly. Then we got closer, and I was relieved to see that they did have faces, but then got completely freaked all over again when I saw that their eyes were all black. Like supernatural Sam and Dean fighting demons, all black. My mom saw it before I did, and she put the pedal to the metal and hightailed it out of there. I remember trying to look back and see them, but I couldn't since it was too dark. My mom didn't go back home until the sun rose, and it was bright enough to not be afraid anymore. Of course, no one believed me at school, and my siblings thought we were just full of it. But we know what we saw. We never saw them again after that, though. I thought that they were spirits. But after a few months, I heard about the black-eyed children on YouTube, or something that made the connection. We moved shortly after that due to unrelated reasons. This was 3 or 4 years ago, and I had blissfully forgotten all about it until my mom said, "Hey, remember when?" And now I want to die. I hope that my irrational anxieties and fear around children that are small enough for me to punt across the soccer field is amusing at least. A few years ago, a friend and I took a road trip across country. We stopped at an out-of-the-way place in Wyoming late at night. As soon as we rolled up, we both felt as if it were haunted, but really needed to sleep, so we checked in and put anything paranormal out of our minds. The place was very run down. We had 2 beds in our room. Mine was closest to the door and window with a nightstand in between us. Also, we each had a little lamp above our beds. I laid down, clicked off my lamp, and was facing the window. While lying down, I saw a black, shadowy figure cross the length of the wall and then vanish. About 30 seconds later, after I had laid my head down, my friend began playing with my hair. I sat upright and said, "What the?" But she was in her bed, 5 feet away, reading her book. I didn't say anything because, as mentioned, we just wanted to sleep. Later that night, my friend woke me and asked if she could sleep in my bed with me. I said yes, but didn't ask why. That morning, we had confession time. I told her that I thought that she was playing with my hair, that's why I sat up in bed before falling asleep. She said that she had looked over and saw a black, shadowy figure hovering above me at the moment when I had looked up. During the night, after she had turned her light off, someone was playing with her feet, rubbing them, massaging them, etc. She couldn't get any sleep and was freaked out, which is why she cowered over to my bed. That morning, we asked the waitress in the very creepy stuffed animal heads on the wall, dark, musty coffee shop if the place was haunted. She said she wasn't allowed to comment on that. We pressured her to tell us the history of the place. She told us that the hotel used to be POW bunkers, where the Chinese had been held or something like that, around World War II. Anyway, I've wanted to go back for a while, and I'm wondering, have any of you had similar experiences? The hotel was in Wyoming, well off the beaten path. This happened about 7 years ago, and still creeps me out. My husband and I were living in this little above-garage apartment that only had like 4 little rooms. It was built in the 1920s. There were a lot of strange occurrences in the apartment before this event, but I thought nothing of it. My husband was in college at the time working on his associate's degree. Neither of us was working. I had no cell service at this point, and my husband's phone was our only real working phone. I had a phone with no service on it except for an internet service called Magic Jack, so that I could call out when he was in class in case I needed help. If it went to voicemail, it would record everything. This is important to this story. One morning, he calls the Magic Jack line to check in on me. He heard the line pick up, then nothing but static. Next morning, my husband had woken me up before, as usual. It was a day off for him. He wakes me up in hysterics. Something had been captured on the line. He played it for me. There was a very clear growl, and then a voice saying what sounds like, "Leave." Very gravelly and angry. Up until this point, my husband didn't believe in the paranormal. He was made a believer that day. Have any of you had something like this happen to you before? How did it change your outlook on the unknown? I'm a die-hard agnostic skeptic with an open mind. I believe that anything is possible, but I want a logical and preferably scientific reason behind that anything. The last 10 days, however, have been absolutely insane. It started when I was a little kid. In my memories, I see kids between the ages of 5 and 11 with solid black eyes and smiles too big for their faces. I had a bad childhood, so I just figured they were added memories by an imaginative mind, because that's the answer that solidly fits my skeptical scientific worldview. Last month, I started seeing a girl. She told me about her experiences with sleep paralysis and shadow people. I explained to her that it was a rational experience caused by being in a hypnagogic state. Then she brought up the Cheshire Cat kids. Her recollections matched mine as a child. It was unnerving to say the least, and she and I spent almost an hour discussing the most minute details about them. Our stories matched. So, she does acid with her friends about 10 days ago, and told me that she stepped outside. A group of 6 of them were waiting for her. They showed her scenes from my life that were my darkest. She described them to me too accurately for her to have heard them from a second-hand source, which would be hard to do anyway, considering that I don't like sharing such detailed information. They then told her that I was going to die soon, and that she should stay away from me. This has put a monkey wrench into one of the most promising relationships of my 25 years. Since that night, I have nightmares of them coming into my room, licking my forehead, and showing me the memories of my past as if they were happening in that moment, complete with smells, sounds, sights, etc. I have written this part off as my subconscious mind reacting with my long-dormant PTSD, but they got more and more vivid. While this is happening, she has been distancing herself more and more. Last night was the weirdest part of the tale, however. I was driving down a windy country road to calm myself, and a pair of headlights flies from around a bend and runs me off the road, almost into a tree. When I looked, however, there was no car, and the headlights extinguished after passing me. I'm chalking all of this up to anxiety-started delusions and possible schizophrenia, but I cannot explain how she knew what she did, and why all of this is suddenly happening. I live in-house of an animal shelter as I'm the on-site vet and do most of the dog's medical needs. We're a non-profit organization, so the majority of our money comes from adoptions, but we are also located out in the middle of the desert, with about 20 acres, give or take a couple of acres. I started working here last month, and I have had so many strange occurrences during my nighttime walkthroughs. Living on site means that I room and board here, and typically you get rats and squirrels, small vermin who will poop and agitate the animals. But last night, I was walking around with my flashlight, and one of the dogs who is very calm and chill, his name is Gizmo. He sort of protects me as I've had a raccoon attack last week and had to get a couple shots and some stitching. He comes with me for protection as he's a guard dog of sorts. He's a pit bull terrier. I was counting our dogs and double-checking everyone had gotten their meds, and the cages were locked. I got to the back where trucks can pull in and go out onto the open lot and see what I assumed was a very large dog. I thought that it was one of our big dogs that got out of his pen, so I approached it. But Gizmo started growling and whimpering and pulling back. I flashed my light, and the dog was hunched over still. I pulled Gizmo and he wouldn't budge. I walk over to the kennel where I thought the dog had escaped, but the fuzzball was in his pen. I flash the light in the direction of the dog again, thinking that it's a stray, and see it standing on its hind legs. I don't think anything of it, but that it's a big dog, and that it'll tear Gizmo to pieces, so I release him from my waist leash, and he takes off back to the gate, and sits there whimpering and barking still. I turn to look back at the dog or thing, and keep my light shining, and get my phone out and have 911 ready to dial. That thing stood tall on its two hind legs, and honestly, I was probably stupid to go closer. I got closer, but it started running away on its two hind legs, and it just sent chills down my spine. Gizmo came back to me and started pulling me away. As I closed and locked the fence, I felt like it was out there again, and so I walked back quick to my room and let Gizmo sleep with me. My boss told me it's my mind playing tricks, but I didn't tell her Gizmo saw and felt the presence as well. I'm posting for my fiancé, who experienced this a few years before we met. He was out at night walking our dog, his at the time, in his parents' neighborhood in southeast Louisiana, where we're from. It was dark, and on his parents' street there's only 2 street lamps at an intersection about half a block down from their house, and another at the end of the street a few blocks from them. He got as far as the first lamp when he saw someone or something down the street, hunched over, digging in the neighbor's garbage cans under the next light. He thinks it may have been furry, but he said the color was dark, like black, gray, or maybe brown. He stopped with the dog, and this thing notices them under the streetlight and straightens up. He said suddenly it was between 7 and 8 feet tall, and its legs were bending in the opposite direction that human legs could bend at the knee. It started coming towards him and the dog at a slow pace, so my fiancé noped and turned around to go back to the house. He looked behind him, and it had sped up, so he sped up. And finally, it was full on running at a lean, and so he took off running back at the house, basically dragging the poor dog behind him, and he could hear whatever it was pounding the pavement. He jumped the ditch, ran through the yard, and into the house. He said sometime after that he noticed very large, very inhuman footprints in the yard, literally right off the concrete path that leads up to their front door. A few nights later, he went out to smoke around 3 or 4 in the morning, and there were more footprints on the concrete directly outside the door, as if this thing was just standing there, looking in the giant window that was in the front door. Also, this was around the same time that summer when a lot of pets were going missing in the area, as in you couldn't go a block without seeing missing posters plastered everywhere. We have no idea what this thing was, and he never saw it again after that, and animals stopped going missing shortly after. We've talked about it a bunch of times, and have been trying to figure it out for years. Last night, my boyfriend went into the room next to our bedroom to play video games while I watched Parks and Rec on my phone on low volume in bed. After an hour or so, he ran in and asked, "Is everything okay?" I stared blankly at him. "Yeah? Why?" He then said he'd heard someone wailing, loudly, and that it sounded like my voice. It couldn't have been Parks and Rec, because I wasn't watching an episode with any sound in it like that, not to mention that the volume was too low to be heard in the other room. It couldn't have been me because I was just chilling. Additionally, I had not heard any wailing sound at all. He said he'd heard it through his gaming headphones a couple of times, wasn't quite sure what it was, took them off, heard it a third time clearly, and then came to check on me. This is strange because a few nights before, I was feeling incredibly ill with severe chills to the point where I couldn't leave the blankets to get more blankets. I was calling for help, and he heard nothing through his headphones. They're pretty good at canceling outside noise, plus he plays the game music at high volume. So who was the Wailing Woman? I grew up in rural Oregon with around 70 acres of wooded private property as my personal playground. By the time I was 16, I had spent countless hours exploring every square foot that I could and had never experienced anything any more unpleasant than poison oak and more than a few blackberry scratches. Oddly, there was one small portion of the property that I had never checked out. I couldn't tell you why I had never gone to this one little corner. I just never did. It was like an unconscious choice to just never go there. There was even an old trail or road leading back to it. One afternoon, I got the itch to turn left and follow that trail. The day was bright and warm. Nothing was sketchy or untoward. However, within 50 feet of the trailhead, I felt an overwhelming need to stop in my tracks. It was like stepping on a giant, sticky mouse trap. My feet simply wouldn't carry me any further forward. As I stood there, every hair on my body stood on end, and I felt absolutely sick to my stomach with dread. I spun in place, looking every direction for whatever danger my body was telling me was there. The spot where I stood was a bit of a clearing in the trees. I had about 20 feet or so of total visibility in all directions, and further in some. There was nothing, not so much as a bird or a bug. I've never felt such utter terror and the desire to go full knees to chest for the hills. I made my way back to the trailhead as fast as I could backpedal, and the second my feet left the trail, it all faded. Hairs back down, stomach settled, and zero sense of unease. It was like stepping out of a room and closing the door. For years I wondered what kind of presence I had encountered. Many naysayers tried to tell me that it was probably just a cougar and it was my sixth sense picking up on it. I wasn't buying it. Then, in talking to my parents one day, who used to wander that property when they were dating a few decades ago, I found out that they had come across the remnants of an old homestead there. It had deteriorated to the point where there was nothing left but the outline of the foundation and some old medicine bottles. I had a light bulb moment. Seems that maybe one of the homesteaders was still there, and I was definitely trespassing. I've had short-lived moments of temptation where I thought about going back there and seeing if I could replicate the experience. In all honesty, though, whatever was there was way too dark for me to ever want to encounter it again. It definitely seems best left alone. I was home alone on Thanksgiving. It was 2015 around evening time, and I heard some knocking. Being in a festive and playful spirit, I opened the door without looking, and automatically felt a deep sense of regret, sort of like a literal, oh shit, moment. I didn't know where it was coming from until I actively started trying to place what was wrong with the situation, and that's when I realized they didn't have any whites in their eyes. For a second I thought, isn't Halloween over? And was confused until the oldest boy made eye contact with me. And that's literally when I felt like I was staring death in the face. They wanted to come in, and the way they spoke made it seem like they knew what I was thinking and were actively mocking my helplessness. I slammed the door on them, turned all my lights on, and started watching TV while they stood outside and would occasionally knock. I felt like I lost a good 6 hours of time because I don't even remember when I fell asleep or what I was last watching. I remember when I first sat down, Gabriel Iglesias was playing, but I don't remember anything. When I woke up, it was around 2 a.m., and the lights were all off, and there was only static on the TV. I have Dish Network, and there were no power outages in my area, and I don't get static if Dish were to go out. I would get a channel listed as an HDMI and a black screen, or it would be the introduction screen where it would show two people talking about the features of Dish Network. Also, if the lights went out, they would come back on. I had to literally switch the lights on and off a few times for it to work, but no one was home. After that, I would occasionally see them outside, and every time it would be pin drop silence, and my lights would occasionally go out or something would lose power like my dish. One time my phone that was at 63% dropped to 1% in 5 minutes. After a few months of being afraid of every knock, I decided to call an imam to bless the house. I also saged the house and brought a lot of different surahs, psalms, to put in every room, including the bathrooms. Since then, the visits have stopped. However, a few months after that, I remember hearing a blood-curdling scream and a banging sound on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing. A few months ago, maybe 2 or so, my mom and I heard a banging coming from the front door, and same thing. No one was there. I don't know if it was them, or something coming back, or just kids playing a prank, but I was so terrified. I traveled quite a bit when I was younger, specifically in the Pacific Northwest of the US, as that's where I'm from. Whenever my single mother, older sister, and I took a break at the various rest stops along the way, I was almost always met by an older woman, likely in her 50s, early 60s. She offered my sister and I a variety of treats, generally hot cocoa and cookies, or lemonade depending on the weather. We always took it graciously. I think my mom assumed that we always bought the things with our allowance at the little shop that's sometimes integrated into the rest stop buildings. But I always remember that woman being at a white plastic table with black legs and never charging us any money. She never spoke. She was the highlight of many trips. I always felt safe and attribute her presence with my love for road trips and rest stops in general. Well, I brought her up a few years back in conversation with my mom and sister, and while my sister seemed to remember her, my mom did not, and pointed out how ridiculous that would be. I honestly hadn't thought much of it since I was 8 or 9, and just took her to be part of the travel experience. But our trips spanned everywhere between Idaho and California, and I know that I saw her at least once every trip from ages 5 to 8. As the chances of us coincidentally meeting so often without my mom noticing are very slim, I can only assume that there was something going on. I know that this could be a muddled memory and have generally ruled it out as one, but I have had many ghost experiences as a child that I hesitate to abandon entirely. Does anyone else have any similar experiences that might be related? If this kind woman is still helping wandering children keep their bellies warm, I would love to leave her a thank you on my next voyage. A good buddy of mine, Andy, and I went for a hike around our local quarry. We took a trail that we hadn't taken before. It had really awesome lookouts and a crazy graveyard that we walked by. It was super cool. We also hiked around to this other awesome spot with big rocks to climb. Then we decided to head back to the car. As we were walking back, Andy said that he felt like he had just walked through a giant spider web on the trail, but couldn't see or feel any strands to pull off. I said, "You just went through a portal," jokingly. He said, also half-jokingly, that he felt like he might have. Then he said that he started feeling a weird static electricity. This was strange because I was feeling the exact same thing. We were walking, and seriously, it felt strangely just intense, with jolts of energy going through both of our bodies. Our plan was to take a break at this cool wooden deck down by the Quarry water. It was about halfway back to the end of the trail. The plan was originally to chill there for a minute and listen to music on the water, but after that happened we were freaking out and wanting to see if we could feel that same electricity again, so we went back the way we came and actually took another way back to the trail. We didn't feel anything this time. We had walked just far enough to kind of dismiss what had happened, but then we got back to the same spot where it had happened before. As soon as we started walking up the trail, all of a sudden it was like everything got so quiet, and it felt like we had walked into a cloud of energy that was even stronger than before. There was even an audible buzzing sound in our ears. It seriously made both of us stop in our tracks and say, "It's happening again." But this time, it was not a very good feeling. Like, I've never had a feeling of, "do not go that way," that intense before. We turned right around and walked the heck out of there, spooked as hell. This happened a couple years ago on a friend's property. His property line comes up to a heavily wooded area where strange stuff is heard at night. We were hanging out in a small shed out back. I had just introduced one of my childhood friends to this guy, and we were hanging out when we hear his pit bulls going crazy, barking and growling at the woods. Then, an extremely loud, high-pitched shrieking comes from the woods, which made my childhood friend jump. As soon as the shriek was heard, his pit bulls came running in, one of them hiding under my chair. A minute or two later, we see 3 sets of very large, opalescent eyes staring into the shed. We started hearing small, light shrieks as they moved closer to us. I could just barely make out a completely white, gray, bony form before my buddy tells us to cover our ears. As soon as I cover my ears, he pulls out an old revolver and fires 3 shots out the open door, chasing these things off. I looked over at my childhood friend, who just looks like he had a heart attack. My buddy puts the gun on the small table and tells me to take him home, which I gladly did. I've been back over there a few times, and every now and then I hear a shriek coming from the woods, accompanied by my buddy pulling back the hammer of his gun. So me and my girlfriend went to Eagle Nest, New Mexico to do some salmon and trout fishing, but by the time we got settled in, it was already too dark. So I had the bright idea to go hiking in the dark, with only flashlights provided by our phones. So I checked Google Maps and saw they had some trails along a river in the Cimarron State Park. We went along Toby Trail and went around half a mile up and decided to turn around because we started hearing noises and felt a little uneasy. As we were heading back, my girlfriend stopped and listened and said she swears she heard something. She shined her light toward the forward part of the trail, and I did the same. We both saw some huge, gray figure that was way bigger than a bear, and we just bolted. We ran for about 20 seconds, maybe 30, and looked back, and it was still keeping up with us. It then makes a horrible, deep sound that was about the mixture of a sheep, goat, and ram all at once. We make it back to my truck safely, but then we decide to pull back up to the gate to the trail to see if it was still there. But we see a man on a horse that we didn't notice when we were running back. He never asked us what we were running from or yelling at, and the horse was brown, so it couldn't have been the horse that we thought was the creature. We're both so confused as to what it could have possibly been. We didn't notice any eye reflection when we shined the light towards it, and I swear it made no noise when it was following us.
It didn't look like a Wendigo or a Skinwalker. It was way too large. When I was like 13, my mom and her boyfriend had to go to the hospital, and no one would be able to get my brother to the bus stop the next morning because they had to stay overnight. So, I got to miss school the next day to take my brother. After I made sure my brother got on the bus, I went home and cleaned and did random stuff, like a 13-year-old would do. It was around 11:45 when there was a knock on my door. Thinking it was the mailman or a neighbor or something, I opened the door and said hello. There was this kid. He couldn't have been much older than me at the time, but he had bangs that were covering his eyes, which I found weird because it was like 107 degrees out. So this kid was super still. Like, I thought that one of my friends put a mannequin there and ran away or something. But then it spoke. It sounded like a robot or something. It was like it was programmed to say this. My mother said to ask someone for a phone in fear that I get lost. Do you have a phone? At this point, I was crapping my pants because 1, I'm a 13-year-old girl, and this older boy was dressed like a burglar and at my door with half his face covered. 2, for some reason, I just couldn't look away. I felt like if I moved or said anything other than yes, that I would explode. And 3, I saw 2 other boys around the same age standing in my driveway dressed exactly the same way as the one in front of me. Baggy jeans, dark hoodie, and scruffed up Vans. I began to stutter and shake my head. It was the only thing I could do. I finally got out a no and then started to close my door, but he put his foot in the way. Then the 2 others started walking up, and I was going, hell no. I grabbed the bat by the door and threatened him. If you don't leave right now, I'll kick your ass and then call the cops. I shouted loud enough so that at least one of my neighbors could hear, I hoped. Now, I was this short girl with SpongeBob pajama pants on. I was in no way intimidating. Then he moved his foot and stepped back into the middle of the other 2 perfectly. Then the far right one said in the exact same tone of voice as the first, I'm sorry to bother you. I'll just come again later and ask. Internally, I was planning my funeral. Just as I was about to close the door, the first one smiled and looked up. And that was when I saw that they had black eyes. Then the other 2 looked up, and they were the same. I was like, nope, and slammed the door shut, then called my neighbor, who was this big-ass 20-something-year-old dude. He ran over and looked for them all around my house, but he said they were gone. When I told my mom all of this, she didn't believe me and said I was lying. Said me, the girl with absolutely no social life, who was afraid of her own shadow, was lying. One night, I was working a night shift in a refinery. I was working as a quote-unquote hole watch for my shift, which means I basically sit at an entrance and document anyone that goes in and out. Well, a guy showed up, I got his name, and he gave me the company that he worked for, so I logged him in. Everything checked out, so I'm waiting at the entrance for a few hours for the guy to come back out. Now, that's nothing unusual, because most of the people that go in will stay in there between 2 to 6 hours at a time, and every hour or 2 I yell up to make sure that they're okay. I would yell, and usually the guys whistle back or make a noise to let me know that everything's alright, and every time I check, I thought I heard a response. A few more guys came up to go in. I log them in, let them know that there's another guy up there doing inspections. They go in and radio back, "Hey, there's no one in here." Immediately, I had a weird feeling because I was at the only exit entrance, so there's no possible way to get out of the container without me seeing. The way the container is set up, you have to climb up a ladder to get into it from underneath using a scaffold to help.
I was sitting on the scaffold far back enough to where if anybody came out, they would drop down right in front of me, and the only way off of it was to go through the gate opening that I was guarding. So I radio my foreman and explained to him what had happened. He got into contact with the company, and they had no one by that name, and no one scheduled to check that particular container. I was completely baffled at this point. Here I am, adamant as ever that someone went up into that container. I thought I was going crazy, and I was also a little weirded out. I had a signature on the log where they sign in, and I have to sign right next to their name also, acknowledging that I know that they're going in. For about 20 minutes, I'm in full panic mode and freaking out because I don't have an explanation as to what happened, or where he went, or who he was. And on top of that, I could have easily lost my job because of it. So this happened a few months back, when I happened to be in the bathroom. I was singing that Willow Smith Wait a Minute song to myself, minding my business, you know. I got to the point in the song where she quotes a phrase said in the Avatar movie in their language. And while I'm singing it, I'm thinking to myself at the same time, I wonder what that actually means translated into English. And as I finished singing the line, simultaneously trying to recall what it translated to, a female, disembodied voice said, "No, you can't." I shut up immediately and paused for a second, shocked. It sounded as if someone were speaking into a tin can, but very clear and only a few feet away. I left the bathroom completely weirded out, and after a few minutes I remembered about wanting to know what the phrase meant. I googled it and found out that it meant "I see you" in English. I was, and am, still blown away by this strange experience. This happened a few years back, on my spring break, senior year of high school. I was hiking part of the Long Trail, which goes south from Glastonbury to Bennington, and it was the usual very cold nights, warm, muddy days Vermont usually has in spring, so pretty fun to hike in. I was going to take a day and rest my feet, go swimming in a pond and cool off, so I took a detour onto the Bald Mountain Trail. I got to my campsite around 5, and the sun was setting, so I set up my hammock and rain tarp and made a fire. I made some Mountain House beef stroganoff and decided to just lay down and watch the flames. I hadn't seen anyone since before noon, which is unusual because it's a pretty well-traveled section of the trail. I started to get really uneasy, and it definitely felt like someone was watching me from a distance. I ended up sitting with my back against a maple, facing the fire and holding my camp knife. A few hours later, 9-ish, I heard a really loud crash in the woods, like a plane falling out of the sky or a freight train right next to me. Then dead silence. No wind, no leaves, no owls, just absolute quiet. I remember getting really uncomfortable and shouting out to see if there was anyone out there, but I just started hearing a really subtle, droning noise, like a key being rubbed on a brass string or radio static, but super low-pitched. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just watched the moon go really slowly over the sky and the sound get quieter as it got lighter outside. When I could see well enough to walk, I picked up my gear and sprinted back to the main trail and found some people up early and hiked with them all the way back. I finally talked my friend into moving from Seattle to Texas. We decided to split the move into 2 parts, the first one last week, moving her stuff in a rented SUV.
We both had some time, and we decided to take the trip on all the back roads. We stayed at a mineral springs resort in the middle of nowhere in Oregon that was amazing. On the second day, we got up to drive to Vegas. We took US 50, which is known as the loneliest highway in America. I will admit that before this, it had been 8 to 10 hours before we had had any human contact. I am a former over-the-road trucker and a US veteran, so I'm used to traveling to different places and being in new surroundings every day, but it also taught me to listen to my instincts. Let me tell you, did they come in loud and clear while on this trip a few hours away from Vegas we stopped to get gas. As we rolled into the place, I just thought it looked aged, very dated. My friend decided to get gas. I walked inside to look at the place and get some snacks. I can honestly say that I can't point to any one thing that was wrong, but the feeling that overcame me was indescribable. It basically told me that the place was, well, the phrase that I would use is out of place, and that I needed to go right then. Now, I'll admit that this could be my own experience, and maybe because I had such a bad feeling that I was imagining things, but the minute I decided to leave, without buying anything or even using the restroom, I swear everybody in the place started looking at me. And I don't mean just the employees, but the patrons. I walked quickly to my car and told my friend that if she believed in instincts, that we should just get in the car and leave right that second. We did, and we did not breathe easy until we were about 10 miles away. That was my spooky encounter in the middle of Death Valley.
This story takes place during the late summer in the 1960s in Iowa in a very small farming community. My friend's great-grandpa, Bob, owned a farm out there. He had acres of corn, wheat, potatoes, etc., but corn was his main crop, so he had a huge cornfield. It was around 2 a.m., and his grandfather couldn't sleep, so he went outside to get some fresh air. While outside, he noticed something that looked like a child walking around in the cornfield. So Bob ran back inside and grabbed his double-barrel shotgun and woke the farmhand for backup. They combed through the cornfield in an attempt to find whatever was running around out there. After a while, they still couldn't find anything, so Bob told the farmhand to go back inside the house while he stayed on the porch to watch his cornfield. Then, as he looks at the gravel road between his yard and the fence line that led to the cornfield, standing on the road was a little girl around 6 years old or so, and she was wearing a white dress that made her look like she had just gotten out of church. Bob thought that his mind must have been playing tricks on him, so he tried to lay down on the couch to rest, but also stay somewhat alert. However, not even a minute after he laid down, he heard a knock on the screen door. He walked up to the door and slightly cracked the main door open. He saw the little girl and asked, "May I help you?" The little girl said, "Mister, I'm lost, and I don't know where my parents are. Can I come in the house and use your telephone?" Bob felt uneasy, and told her that he could get her a glass of water and that he can call her parents for her if she gave him the number, but he didn't feel comfortable allowing her in his home. He felt something off about the little girl. However, the little girl insisted to be the one to call and talk to them. And Bob said, "Young lady, it's 2 a.m, and I don't feel right letting a stranger into the house, little girl or not." The little girl started to get agitated and said, "I'm not leaving until you let me in to use your phone." Startled, Bob told the little girl that he was going to call the police to come pick her up so that they could keep her safe and find her parents. He closed the door to go and call the police, and he heard someone punch the door like a grown man. He walked back and cracked the door open again, but when he looked, he realized that it was still the little girl, and that she was the one who had punched the door. But when he looked at her this time, she didn't have any eyes. Instead, she had pitch black orbs instead of eyes, and she said in a deep voice, "Let me in." Bob grabbed his shotgun and pointed it at the little girl and told her no and to go away. After this, the little girl looked right into the barrel and then back up at Bob, smiled smugly at him, and giggled before she ran back into the cornfield and disappeared. Back in 2018, I decided to move out to another state. My friend's mom said that she had seen me a few times on our street at 4 a.m. while she was driving to work. I came back in 2019 and stayed for a couple of weeks and then left to a different state. A couple of nights after I had left, my friend says that she was getting out of her friend's car to head to the front door when she sees me heading to the front door with my 2 red suitcases and the guitar case that I had. She said that once she got out, I turned around and went across the street, going in front of the headlights, where she got a good look at me. I was wearing the same clothes that I had left in, had the same suitcases, and the same guitar case. They say it's a Skinwalker, which would make sense because the entire area we live in were Indian burial sites. The area has always been supercharged with energy, but from my understanding, skinwalkers imitate animals? I'm not sure what it was. Definitely wasn't a ghost, because I'm still alive. But now I'm back here with my friend at the same house, and I would really like to know what could be impersonating me. When I was a kid, I was with my family on a road trip a few hours away. We were driving down through a winding canyon, and it was dark. I was looking out my window, just staring at the dirt walls that we were passing. It was like the inside of cliffs on one side and forest on the other. Well, I was on the side of the car with the dirt hills and the cliff walls, and as we turned to go around a bend, I saw something human-shaped, which looked like it had a long, white face that resembled the Scream mask, hanging on the hillside. It happened so fast that it scared me to death nearly. I never said anything. I think it was because I wasn't sure what I had just seen, but I really don't think that it was a human being. This vivid memory is still clear as day. I work night shift on a unit at a nursing home. I hear and see a lot of weird things, but nothing much with meaning. Me and the other aide were walking down my hall to go check on a fall risk resident when we got in front of the door to an empty room that stays locked. The resident had moved home and no one had been in there since mid-October. I heard 3 distinct knocks coming from inside the room on the door as soon as we walked by. I froze and turned around, and without speaking looked at my friend, waiting for her to say if she had heard it as well, and when she did, I was frozen in fear, knowing that I was not alone in hearing things. Lots of little extra things have also happened. Me and another aide walked by a room when we got bad vibes. It was cracked open an inch, and the door slammed shut suddenly, so hard that it shook the floor. Right next to the room with the knocks, we had a resident pass away. Again, me and an aide walked by. The door was closed and locked, and the handle started jiggling hard and fast. Another time, me and an aide heard snarling growls coming from the dining room all night. The same night when the knocks occurred. There were also instances of running faucets in the residents' bathrooms, in the basement, anywhere that I went, had a resident complaining of water running all night. This happened around 12 years ago when a group of teens and a few adult chaperones went to a youth conference that was being held at the casino in Minneapolis. Being teenage girls, my friend and I met these guys and decided to snag. I'm native, so that's like hooking up. We stayed out past our curfew and walked around the casino with them, venturing to the golf course. If you've ever been here, the course is huge. We walk over a few small hills that blocked the casino light, and it was moonlit so we could still see pretty well. One of the guys stops and says, "What's that?" So we follow his gaze and see this extremely tall, white, almost glowing figure loping along the next hillside. It looked like the aliens you see on TV, tall and slender, but instead of being green, it was completely white. None of us made a sound as we watched it for a few more seconds, when it turned suddenly and started coming in our direction. We immediately took off running and didn't stop until we were back inside the casino. We all had tears in our eyes, and we didn't talk about it after that. I don't remember even telling our chaperones and friends because we got in so much trouble when our group found us. I definitely believe in each tribe's ghost stories, though I never asked anyone about this particular area. About 4 years ago, I took my dog for a short hike. It was about a mile walk from the car to the beach along the Strait of Juan de Fuca in Washington state. The trail led us through the tall cedar trees, and then to a large clearing which led to the beach. My dog and I played on the beach for a while before I decided to head back. We stopped and took a break at a picnic table in the middle of the clearing. My dog, being the monkey she is, was standing on top of the picnic table looking around when she fixated on a spot across the field and her hair rose on the back of her neck. Always one to trust my pup, I became extra observant. As we stood there, a black mist appeared out of thin air to our right. I watched as it took on a long form roughly the size of a human. It glided across the trail and dissolved. It was really like looking at a small black translucent cloud. It scared the crap out of me and my dog, and I boogied back to the car. I've never found an answer to what the black mist was. So it was around May of this year when I was playing hide and seek with my family. When the game started, I went to the basement. But after a couple minutes, I was about to be spotted, so I moved to the bathroom, but went backwards into the bathroom. Keep in mind, I was facing the doorway, and that is when it started. When I heard the groans, I froze. They didn't sound human, so I knew it wasn't one of my family members. A couple of minutes went by, and I could still hear the groans, but built up the courage to run out of the bathroom. A couple of more minutes went by. I could still hear the groans, and I had to build up the courage to run from the bathroom. That's all I have to share. If you could explain what happened, then that would be great. My great-grandmother died in that house. It was built in the 1940s, and that basement bathroom was built very poorly.